Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Renda Slim, Director of the Program on Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues at the Middle East Institute. We are very pleased that you have joined us for this expert discussions on Iraq. The Conflict Management Program at Johns Hopkins SAIS is co-sponsors of today's program. And the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, with which I'm affiliated, is also represented on the panels. We are recording this event and will post video and podcast of the content on the website mei.edu. Please silence your mobile devices. We encourage you to tweet about the event. As many of you know, I am an avid tweeter or tweep, and ask that you use the hashtag IraqMEI. I would like to call your attention to MEI's annual award banquet and conference, which are coming up on November 14 and 15. We will honor Sheikha Hussa Sabah of Kuwait and philanthropist Fadi Ghandour at the banquet, and we have a terrific slate of panelists the next day. Please see the MEI website to buy your banquet tickets and register for the conference, which is free and open to all. Now, let's turn to today's event. We are honored to have the senior-most State Department official responsible solely for Iraq policy, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Joseph Pennington, to open our program. Two expert panels will follow him. My SAIS and MEI colleague, Dr. Daniel Serwer, and I will introduce our respective panels in turn. Each session will include time for audience question, but we will try to close promptly by 4:30 this afternoon. You have our keynote speaker's professional biography in your program booklet. I will say simply that he's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service of the United States. He began his current assignment as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq in December 2015, after having served as the Director of the Office of Iraq Affairs, after returning from a 2-year assignment as Consul General at the U.S. Consulate General in Erbil. He has over 2 decades of experience in regions experiencing or recovering from conflict, both in the Middle East and in the Balkans. We are looking forward to hearing his perspective on the domestic and regional challenges facing Iraq, the U.S. interests at stake, and U.S. policy. This gathering could not have been more timely. We have witnessed the developments in the last few days in Kirkuk. Iraq's old problems are back to the fore after having been sidestepped by the fight against ISIS. As this fight starts winding down, new old issues are re-entering the political space on force and pose new threats to the long-term security and stability of Iraq. I imagine our esteemed speaker has plenty to say about these recent developments, and we can explore them further with him in the question and answer segment. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joseph Pennington.
Thank you very much, Rhonda, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to first thank the Middle East Institute for organizing this conference today, to SAIS for hosting it, and for the invitation for me to speak. It's obviously a very timely, and I think the number of friends who are going to be speaking on the panels, I hope I can stay around for some of those. We have others from my office who will be here for others, but it should be a really good discussion. In my remarks, what I would try to limit myself to 15, maybe a little more than 15 minutes, and really leave the bulk of the time for discussion, for question and answer. And just up front, the events of the last several days, I will touch on at the end of my remarks briefly, but mostly we'll leave those to question and answer. I really want to address the broader themes of Iraq, U.S. interests in Iraq, our policy in Iraq, and sort of raise perhaps some issues and questions to be followed up by the panels. But really do want to leave the bulk of the time for what should be an interesting discussion. In 2014, all of us witnessed a scourge that nearly destroyed Iraq's political compact. As our consul general in Erbil at that time, I got a closer look at this than most of you here today, except perhaps our Iraqi and Iraqi Kurdish friends. I will never forget the moment, in fact, when I was standing in my little living room on our compound in Erbil, and Brett McGurk was standing with me. We were about to go off to a meeting with the region's vice president, Khosrat Rasul, and I got a call on my cell phone to alert me that Mosul had fallen to ISIS. I mentioned that to Brett, and of course we immediately canceled our meeting, reoriented our day to begin what came over the next weeks and months to be a process of establishing the partnerships in Baghdad and Erbil with the United States, and ultimately what became the coalition that enabled the progress that we've seen in the past 3 years against ISIS, which I will mention. But that moment is etched in my mind, and all that followed, of course, including ISIS's efforts to capture large parts of Iraq, even to Baghdad, and its move toward Erbil. But during that summer, ISIS's capture of vast areas of Iraq threatened the very idea of Iraq. The so-called caliphate offered a barbaric and despotic system that paid no respect to Iraq's millennia of vital contributions to human civilization. ISIS thrust into northern Iraq, ripped apart the rich fabric of Iraq's ancient minority communities in the Nineveh Plain. Its forces threatened Baghdad, threatened Erbil and the south before being repulsed and settling into an occupation of large areas in the provinces of Nineveh, Diyala, Anbar, and Salahuddin. 3 years later, as ISIS grows ever weaker in Iraq, Iraqis now have an opportunity to forge a new way ahead, to develop a politics that is responsible to the needs of Iraqi citizens and puts the country on a more confident path toward lasting stability. But what does that kind of Iraq actually look like? Well, what Iraq's constitution envisions and what we are working to support is a united, prosperous, stable, federal, democratic Iraq, one that is inclusive of its ethnic and religious diversity, an Iraq at peace with itself, at peace with its neighbors, and an Iraq that rejects terrorism and is capable of combating it. These key objectives are also very much in the United States' national interest, and we are working hard to achieve them. They are also critical to achieving a sustainable Iraqi political compact. Today, I want to focus on what the U.S. government is doing to advance these goals, the Iraqi political context we are operating in, and the most urgent challenges we face in this endeavor. The Defeat ISIS campaign continues to progress toward wresting all the remaining parts of Iraqi territory out of ISIS' hands. In that context, I think it's especially notable that Iraqis have been in the forefront of this fight. And when I say Iraqis, it is understood I mean Iraqis of all stripes, Kurds, non-Kurds, Iraqis. Iraqi troops have done the bulk of the fighting against ISIS, a positive development given how thoroughly ISIS routed the Iraqi army back in 2014. They have taken significant casualties in military operations, Peshmerga, Iraqi security forces. This does not mean the struggle is over, of course, because truly defeating ISIS, as we all know, requires more than battlefield success. Ensuring that Iraqi internally displaced persons can return to their homes in areas liberated from ISIS control is an immediate need and is key to stabilizing Iraq. We are seeing some encouraging results on this front. Mosul, the capital of ISIS' so-called caliphate in Iraq, or presence in Iraq, saw fierce fighting that heavily damaged the city. The fighting that dislodged ISIS from the center of control in western Mosul was especially disruptive and reduced much of the city to rubble. Indeed, 800,000 residents of Mosul remain displaced. But with support from all members of our coalition, including a $265 million commitment from the United States. Residents in liberated areas, including Mosul, are working to rebuild their communities, and many have already returned. Even in Mosul, 366 Iraq-led, UN-implemented, coalition-funded stabilization projects are already underway. This is part of a larger number, 1,240 such projects that are underway throughout the country. These projects have already facilitated the safe and voluntary return of nearly 300,000 people to Mosul alone. Nationwide, the UN Development Program, UNDP, has used funds provided by coalition partners, including the United States, to restore basic services and livelihoods in areas liberated from ISIS. These projects, in support of Iraqi efforts, have facilitated the return of more than 2.2 million displaced persons. Because of ISIS' deliberate targeting of Iraqi civilians through improvised explosive devices, and booby traps in homes and public buildings, demining remains a fundamental element of our stabilization program. US-funded demining teams are working in Nineveh to clear critical infrastructure, a prerequisite for increased returns of displaced populations. As a result of US efforts in this area, over 40 tons of explosive hazards have been cleared throughout Iraq. So far in 2017, we have provided approximately $48 million in support of demining operations, resulting in the clearance of over 3.8 million square miles of land, the destruction of more than 10,500 landmines, unexploded ordnance, and IEDs. We've also educated more than 38,500 Iraqi men, women, and children about the potential dangers from landmines and unexploded ordnance in their communities. As stabilization efforts move forward and active military operations against ISIS wind down, we envision a steep decline in the number of Iraqi IDPs in the coming year. In fact, the Iraqi government is already turning its attention to the even more complex issue of the country's long-term reconstruction. And the costs of reconstruction, variously estimated at tens of billions of dollars and perhaps even higher than that, are far more than the Iraqi state, even with the support of its international partners, can bear. While the United States continues to urge regional partners and donor countries to contribute to this effort, reconstruction on such an enormous scale will not be possible without unlocking the capacity of Iraq's private sector. In order to attract the private investment that Iraq requires, Iraq, of course, will need to improve its regulatory and investment climate and address the rampant corruption that plagues its economy. Indeed, Iraq's fiscal situation remains troubled, but has shown significant improvement since the 2016 G7 summit in Japan, where key coalition partners, including the United States, stepped into support. Iraq continues to abide by the terms that the IMF requires to meet its obligations under the standby arrangement. The IMF agreement also forces Iraq to take tough measures to implement much-needed public sector reforms, to reduce spending, and find ways to generate non-tax revenue streams. The World Bank has a third and final tranche of a development policy loan set to transfer to Iraq this December, also tied to structural economic reform. The bank is now looking toward moving past stabilization and into post-ISIS reconstruction. On the political side, there are reasons for hope that Iraq is in fact moving in the right direction to build on and sustain the success achieved in the effort to defeat ISIS and return life to liberated communities. Iraqis are increasingly seeing that their problems require national solutions, which means that there are now enhanced prospects for cross-sectarian coalitions before or after the upcoming general election. Moving beyond a sectarian political framework would give all Iraqis more of a stake in the Iraqi state. Merely being Sunni or Shia is no longer enough to command the support of constituents. Leaders must have something to show for it, and what we've seen from the Iraqi people is a demand for better governance. Social media, in fact, are filled with postings from Iraqis calling for better government. Their demands are couched not in sectarian terms in most cases, but in practical ones. An end to corruption, a better standard of living, leaders that care more about the Iraqi people than about lining their pockets, and a state that is effective enough to provide that most basic need, security, and is able to stop suicide bombings and prevent a group like ISIS from ever again presenting such an existential threat to the Iraqi state. Progress towards less sectarian politics is especially crucial to blunt the future of appeal of ISIS and other Sunni extremist groups that are fueled by the politics of grievance and alienation. Iraq's provincial and national elections, both scheduled for early 2018, will reveal whether any of these potentially positive trends are turned into enduring features of Iraq's political landscape. For that to happen, Iraq will first need to overcome legal and institutional obstacles that stand in the way of a smooth election process. The election law, which details the date of the election, how and where votes will be counted, and other technicalities, remains stuck in Parliament because members are trying to tailor the law to fit their political interests. Iraq has also failed so far to elect new members to the Independent High Election Commission, IHEC. As with the elections law, the voting on IHEC members is mired in political bickering. The longer the IHEC standoff drags on, the more likely it is to become a flashpoint for internal political strife. And of course, once IHEC, the new IHEC, is in place, it will need to focus on the critical issue of inclusive participation of all Iraqis, including those who remain displaced. Once Iraq surmounts the technical hurdles to the election, another challenge will be the role of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, who have been central to Iraq's military victories against ISIS, and whether they participate in this election or through their proxies. The PMF remains popular in Iraq. Much of that organization, as you know, is made up of volunteers who responded to Grand Ayatollah Sistani's fatwa and mobilized to defend Baghdad when ISIS threatened the capital in the summer of 2014. However, the PMF also includes a number of well-known groups that are highly problematic and heavily influenced by Iran. Some of these groups were responsible for killing American forces in the years after 2003 and are unlikely to submit fully to Baghdad's control. We know that some of the most problematic groups close to Iran are interested in running for office or having their proxies run for office in Iraq's next national elections. And if they win or do well, they will almost certainly adopt political positions that are sectarian and beholden to Tehran. Whether as a political actor or a security organization, these parts of the PMF will likely present a major challenge to the Iraqi state post-ISIS. As you know, rolling back that Iranian influence is a major goal of the Trump administration. And the best way, we believe, to push back Iran in Iraq is by bolstering the Iraqi state politically and economically. Iraq and Iran will always have an important relationship, given their geographic proximity, linked economies, and shared elements of their history. But U.S. support for strengthening the Iraqi state, connecting Iraq to Western institutions, and over the longer term, developing the economic and commercial ties that offer Iraqis access to Western technology, Western investment, and Western business practices will help reduce the appeal of the worst aspects of the Iranian state's ideology. No Iraqi leader aspires to be the vassal of another state, and I've never met an Iraqi who wants to be ruled from Tehran. Some of the real and organic differences between Iran and Iraq will persist into the future, no matter who is in charge. For now, a hopeful sign is that Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi's instincts seem well suited to forging a politics that is more inclusive, including of Sunnis and smaller minorities, and to creating the sort of political arrangement that is ultimately going to be more stable. During major combat operations against ISIS, the Prime Minister stressed that Iraqi forces must be accountable, must not commit human rights violations, particularly against Sunnis, because the areas liberated were majority Sunnis. The track record was not perfect, but we saw significant progress toward greater accountability and a willingness to take reports of abuses seriously. In areas that Iraqi forces liberated from ISIS control, the Prime Minister insisted on working the humanitarian and stabilization issues through the locally elected authorities. In most cases, these were Sunnis. These approaches and the liberation process itself were noticed by Iraqi Sunnis whose level of trust in the Prime Minister and in central government institutions is on the rise. Prime Minister Abadi's more inclusive instincts are also playing out in Iraq's regional relationships. Prime Minister came to office pledging to pursue better relations with Iraq's Arab neighbors and has gained some significant traction in this regard. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Jubeir visited Baghdad in February of this year, the first time a senior Saudi official has traveled to Iraq since the eve of the Gulf War in 1990. This opened the way for the Prime Minister's reciprocal trip to Saudi Arabia in June. The two countries are now starting to work together to keep terrorists from traversing their shared borders while ensuring that those borders remain open for increased trade. They have already opened one border crossing point, and discussions about a second border point opening are underway. Last Monday, Saudi Arabia's cabinet took the important step of establishing a joint cooperation council to advance bilateral security and economic interests with Iraq. Progress continued last week with the Saudi Arabian Airlines announcement that in a few weeks it will begin flights from the kingdom to several cities in Iraq. Again, first time in 27 years. On the Iraq-Jordan border, the Traybil border crossing is now open for the first time since the incursion of ISIS, and we are working to help the Iraqis develop this important overland trade route. This, together with the positive development in Saudi relations with the Gulf more broadly, has the potential to boost trade and economic development in Iraq's mostly Sunni Anbar province and other areas. The prospect of better economic opportunities, of course, would give Iraqi Sunnis more of a stake in the Iraqi state and reduce the appeal of extremist groups' empty promises of a better future than what the state can provide. Kuwait has announced that it will hold a reconstruction conference early in 2018 to bring together donors that can help bolster Iraq economically, and that will build on U.S. efforts to marshal World Bank and IMF support for Iraq that I described earlier. Through these efforts, Iraq is well on its way to regain its important role in the broader region, a process that will, over time, I believe, serve to balance Iraq's foreign relations. Of course, the Iraqi state, and the picture I've described, faces significant challenges as Iraq strives to improve security and stability. The most immediate challenge, of course, is the Kurdistan Regional Government's independence referendum, which the Kurds held on September 25th in the face of opposition from Baghdad, the United States, and nearly the entire international community. We continue to believe that a strong, independent, unified Iraq would best provide the security and stability needed for a sustainable Iraqi future. As is well known, we urged the Kurdistan region's president, Masoud Barzani, not to proceed with the referendum and to instead pursue serious and sustained dialogue with the central government within the framework of the Iraqi constitution. We offered to broker those discussions along with the United Nations to achieve concrete progress toward resolving the outstanding issues that have bedeviled Baghdad-Erbil relations since 2003, and in fact, in some cases earlier. We were especially concerned that holding the referendum in Iraq's disputed territories would be perceived as an attempt to impose a unilateral solution on a very complicated set of issues that can only be resolved through sustained, determined negotiations. The events of the past week in Kirkuk and elsewhere have shown us the potential dangers of post-referendum conflict in Iraq. Strife between Iraqi forces and the Kurds threatened to distract both sides from finishing off major combat operations against ISIS just when that cooperation was most needed. We remain very concerned about the continuing fallout from the referendum as the central government attempts to reassert its constitutional prerogatives at borders, airports, and most significantly in the disputed territories. We are urging both sides to engage in dialogue and work towards resolving their differences peacefully. Prime Minister Abadi made clear before the referendum that if President Barzani went ahead with his plans, it would undermine their strong relationship and make negotiations untenable in a post-referendum environment. Iraq's key government institutions, the Supreme Court, its parliament, its prime minister, all continue to maintain the referendum was unconstitutional and are demanding that President Barzani annul the results. This, of course, is something that President Barzani cannot do without losing serious credibility in his own constituency, and so the impasse persists. Our efforts are aimed at finding more limited areas for progress that are both critical, at the same time feasible, deconflicting military forces and military movements, developing joint approaches to administering disputed areas, and establishing joint security mechanisms. We are urging all sides to de-escalate tension and avoid unilateral actions that could lead to confrontation or unhelpful intervention by Iraq's neighbors. While there are certainly risks in the short term, and I've identified one, we remain committed to helping bring the parties together and working with them to forge a practical return to stability. So while I end my remarks by highlighting a very serious challenge to Iraq's political compact, we should not let the current crisis overshadow the enormous strides that Iraq has made over the past 3 years toward crushing ISIS and in pursuing political and structural reforms that serve the interests of all Iraqis. I think I'll stop there. I'd be happy to take your questions.
All right. Thank you very much again for your very insightful remarks and for taking the time from, what I'm assuming, a very busy schedule to be here with us. So just following on your last remarks about what's next with respect to the Erbil-Baghdad relationship. I looked at the October 3 congressional testimony that you gave at the time, then, and in which you said that high-level negotiations on the future of Baghdad-Erbil relations may prove to be difficult in the near term. Now, and you here talked about the strategy going forward for the US in managing the fallout of the referendum, of the Kirkuk operation yesterday, is to focus on more defined sets of issues which you have identified. But there still needs to be a dialogue, on the overall relationship. Who will start this? Do you see the UN, taking it over? There was this offer that you referred to pre-referendum to broker this, a new dialogue or to moderate a new dialogue. So what is your perspective on this going forward? Somebody needs to get these two parties to start talking about this relationship.
So first, let me just say, again, at the moment we have sort of a rolling crisis situation. This situation that has been building in the last days is still ongoing. It's not over by any means. There are new developments seemingly by the hour. Our effort for the moment and for the foreseeable future is aimed at minimizing the potential for additional confrontation, aimed at de-escalating tensions, returning to a sense of normalcy and stability that may, at some point, allow for broader issues to come into the conversation. But frankly, I think that to expect the Prime Minister to engage in a sort of open-ended discussion of the future relationship between Baghdad and Erbil under current circumstances, and particularly as he heads into an election season, I think it will be very difficult. I would never say impossible, but the Prime Minister made it clear before the referendum that this would be the outcome, that it would make that discussion, which he was open to, make it more difficult. We said the same thing privately, we said the same thing publicly. The discussion that was available on September 24th, not available at this time. It will depend on how this crisis unfolds. It will depend on the politics heading into the election as to when the time would be right to perhaps revisit some of those issues. But for now, again, we are focused on getting through this crisis, deconflicting, and establishing a new security arrangement.
Right, thank you. Now, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it to the audience because we have a lot of Iraq experts who are in the audience who are eager to ask you questions. The second question has to do with the US-Iraq strategy. We have, going forward, ISIS, the fight against ISIS is winding down. The reports from the governments in Baghdad that by the end of this year, Iraq is expected to be liberated of ISIS. So going forward, we have heard so much about a strategy that's being put in place to help consolidate, the security gains, to help Iraq, keep the peace. There is a lot of tough work that Iraq and Iraqis have to do. They need to heal their country, and this is up to them to do that. But what is going to be the US policy post-ISIS on Iraq?
And so, thank you. I touched on some of
Yes.
this in my remarks.
Yes.
But let me just say, I think for those of you who've been doing Iraq issues, looking at Iraq issues since 2003 or even earlier, and I admittedly came to all of this late in 2000. I've only been doing this for 4.5 years, so I'm a relative newcomer. But let me just say that for those of you who remember Iraq and the Iraq-US relationship in the years immediately after 2003, we are not in that situation anymore. This is not a United States policy that is trying to impose a solution on Iraq. And so, and I was asked at the hearing that you referred to, what is the US political plan for Iraq? I had to answer. I was honest with the congressman who asked the question. I said, it's not a question of any US political plan. We've tried a US political plan, didn't work out. These are Iraqi problems. They require Iraqi solutions. All that said, of course, the United States will remain fully engaged with all of our partners across the political spectrum, with Baghdad, with Erbil, with the regions, and we facilitate discussion. We encourage progress in the direction that is, we think, the way Iraq should be going, and in fact corresponds to US interest in achieving stability, inclusiveness in Iraqi governance. But I can't stress this enough, as in the case of the counter-ISIS campaign, as has been the case in stabilization, our approach to stabilization, same in the approach to Iraqi politics. Our approach is to support. These are, again, Iraqi problems, Iraqi solutions.
Right, thank you. I'm going to open it up now for questions from the audience. We have 2 micros, and sir, first micro here. And then this is a question and answer. You ask the question, Mr. Pennington answers. So please, no comments. Thank you. Please.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former Foreign Service officer. There's something like 3 to 4 times more Kurds in the world than there are Palestinians. So I have trouble understanding why Palestine deserves a state and Kurdistan doesn't. I mean, isn't this sort of an American hubris to tell a people that they have to be chained to some other people for the rest of human history? Wouldn't we be better off getting on the right side of history and shepherding that independence?
I mean, the United States has certainly never outlined a position as you just described it. The United States has a policy, supports a united federal Iraq. We also, though, in the run-up to the referendum, offered to broker and facilitate discussions, along with our international partners, between Baghdad and Erbil of the future of that relationship. Another path was chosen, and we are now living, so we're living with the results of that. But I think our interests in Iraq are separate from the sort of the larger question that you pose. We are focused on governance in Iraq. And, unilateral actions such as the referendum, we feel, are not helpful, particularly at this point in time, to achieving the stability that is desperately needed in that region.
The lady here, please. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Nike Chin. I am the State Department correspondent for Voice of America. D.S. Pennington, thank you so much for the remarks. You addressed Kirkuk, and then we saw the statement yesterday from the State Department supporting, quote, a peaceful exercise of a joint administration of all disputed areas. My question for you is, could you please elaborate on that? In your vision, what would be a stable and secure Kirkuk? Thank you.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it is. So what we were getting at in that statement is that under Iraq's constitution, the federal government, the central government, absolutely has a right to have a presence in disputed territories. Those territories, no matter whose control they have been under, they remain disputed. There is a constitutional mechanism for resolving ultimate disposition of those territories. But there is a federal prerogative to be present in the territories. And so what we said in the statement was reflective of our long-term policy, long-standing policy, that we support a joint exercise of authority in the disputed territories. Obviously, there needs, before you can get to the details of what that looks like, you need to get a stable environment to have those discussions, and you need to be able to bring people together. And so we're in the early stages of trying to get to those steps to determine what the details would look like. Again, it will be up to the government in Baghdad and the government in Erbil to work out what a joint administration with joint security arrangements will ultimately look like on the ground. But we were stating our sort of broad vision.
Yes, please. Brent, تفضل.
Thank you very much. My name is Renda Rahim. If I could reverse Renda's Slim's question, or actually the congressional question, not by asking what are U.S. plans for Iraq, but in a different way. Beyond ISIS, are there any U.S. vital national interests in Iraq? And if so, could you please identify them? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, of course there are. You've mentioned one, which
Sorry,
is...
could I just say, and I don't mean you want prosperity and happiness for the Iraqi people.
No, I will be very specific, and I will give you four.
What's wrong with prosperity and happiness?
Although we do want.
I mean, we all desire them.
Of course, the answer is yes. In addition to defeating ISIS, which is our #1 strategic priority in Iraq, remains so today. Stability in Iraq and the broader region, obviously a vital interest. Energy resources, a continued flow of energy resources to world markets, clearly strategic U.S. interest. And the prevention of a reemergence of another ISIS 2.0, Al-Qaeda 3.0, whatever it might be. So there are several. And I would add to, and this falls under the regional stability rubric, and I mentioned it, having Iraq as a key, playing its, I guess, historic key role as part of its region is a strategic U.S. interest because it goes directly to the question of regional stability. And if I may I'll give even more than you want. And fifth, and some might put this higher on the agenda, is constraining Iranian influence. constraining Iranian malign influence.
How does Iraq help with that?
So Iraq, again, in my view, Iraq is in a very delicate position with regard to Iran. It shares a long border with Iran. It shares history. It shares community ties. It shares certain religious ties. There are also a lot of differences, as you know, linguistically, ethnically, theologically, politically, historically. And historically, Iraq and Iran have been competitors than one playing a dominant role to the other. But I think, again, to push, when we talk about rolling back Iranian influence in Iraq, and we all agree that Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq, some of it is we would regard as very unhelpful in Iraq, is to strengthen Iraqi institutions which naturally and historically have shown that there will be pushback to Iraq, and also, of course, to increase Iraq's ties with more benevolent actors, Western actors. And that's where we get to the sort of the U.S. broader relationship with Iraq, going beyond ISIS, going beyond security into economic areas, cultural areas, investment, getting the kinds of Western influences with which Iran cannot compete in Iraq. And most Iraqis, I think, when they look to their future, they want a future that gives economic hope. That economic hope, high technology, investment, clean business practices, it's not going to come from the East.
Gentleman in the back, sitting in the last row.
Thank you. My name is Nick Riker. I'm a Middle East observer from the United Kingdom. Mr. Pennington, I think we share an interest in political economy. And many observers have said that ever since 2003, Iraq's political cohesion has been undermined by an American-inspired obsession with free market fundamentalism. And I wonder, from your background, to what extent you share any of that view, and is it still a problem today?
Well, it's a very broad question. If you look at it back to 2003, we had a certain approach, I think, back in 2003, and what Iraq's economic future should be that was perhaps clumsily rolled out and was unsuccessful. I think we can agree on that. Again, this is an Iraqi challenge that is a long-term challenge. It's not going to be an easy one to address, given the problems that I cited with not only with corruption, which is an obvious one, but a lack of exposure to Western business practices, a problem with rule of law, enforcing contracts. But in terms of economic policy, there's a range of policies that the Iraqi government can choose, from sort of more Wild West private sector led, which doesn't seem to be the trend, to a mixed economy. Obviously, there is a heavy state sector, and including in the energy area. But those are a range of policy options. But I think what we want to help, I think where we can be helpful to Iraq is in sort of the more basic areas, limited areas that I just identified. Rule of law, enforcing contracts, giving businesses the confidence they need, the Western businesses, the confidence they need that if they go into Iraq, make a heavy investment, that they'll be treated fairly. Those are things that don't prejudge a highly privatized or a heavily public sector-oriented economy. So I think there are two sort of separate questions. The Iraq economic policy, totally an Iraq decision that will be played out through the political process, but areas where we can be supportive to connect Iraq to Western markets and Western investment, which won't, unless those reforms are made of the kind I described, Western companies won't go there. And so it will be a missed opportunity for Iraq.
Yes, sir.
Dan Lieberman, I'm a writer. You say that Iran has much influence, but some of it is malevolent, and they need to turn to more benevolent authorities. But aren't you being patronizing in defining these words? And aren't you really saying that the Iraqi people are not mature enough to make up their mind of what is malevolent and what is benevolent?
Perhaps if I was patronizing, I apologize. I was not meaning to be, obviously. What I'm trying to get at, maybe I phrased it clumsily, what I'm trying to get at is clearly there is an affinity for many Iraqis with many parts of Iranian society and culture, and that's not a problem. Iran, like any state, will try to exert influence in its region to advance its interests. That's to be expected. Where we get into what I would call malign influence is when it comes to steps that are taken to put pressure and coerce governments, security forces, and others into taking actions that they otherwise wouldn't take, or trying to influence events on the ground in ways that are in Iran's interest, but perhaps not in the interests of Iraq and its citizens. That's the kind of influence that we find problematic. We recognize that there will always be a normal relationship there. And when I say benevolent, probably a clumsy use of the word, but giving Iraq other opportunities. I mean, ultimately, it's up for Iraqis to choose whether they want to be more engaged with the West, with the United States, whether they want less U.S. presence. We are there on the military side, on the security side, we're there at the request of the Iraqi authorities. And whether the same thing could be said about Iran in every case, I'm not so sure. But of course, Iraqis have every right to choose how they want to develop their foreign relations and who they want to choose as their partners. What I'm saying is that I think the Western option offers many things that many Iraqis aspire to that can't be delivered by their Eastern neighbor.
Sure, please.
Hi, I'm Christopher Blanchard with the Congressional Research Service. Just a sort of factual clarification, as you're aware, the response to the events of the last 48 hours, there's a lot of speculation about Iran's role in those events. Could you offer your views on whether or not it's fruitful or accurate to view Iran as the principal author and beneficiary of those events?
Yes, my view is no. These were largely, these are Iraqi, the movements of Iraqi forces, led by, in fact, by the Counterterrorism Service, which is Iraq's best and most disciplined fighting force, in fact, US-trained force. There was, as in most Iraqi military movements, there was a mix of forces, and there certainly were some PMF forces in that mix. But I think the decision to have the CTS in front was deliberate. I think also we need to filter out some of the more alarmist things that we have seen in media, and I don't want to minimize, in fact, what has taken place. These are significant events. There have been deaths. We recognize that. These are tragic events for those cases. But on the main, what we have seen, the Iraqi government engaging in discussions with parts of the Kurdish leadership that controls the areas that they wanted to establish, in which they wanted to establish a federal presence, to make arrangements for Iraqi security forces to move into these areas and establish that presence. In most cases, they have done that in a way that has not been confrontational, that has, there are exceptions. Obviously, there are exceptions, and I say, be very clear about that. There have been isolated incidents of confrontation. But to describe this as somehow an attack against, by the Iraqis against the KRG is, in our view, not accurate. But back to your initial question, we very much see this as Iraqi movement.
A quick question on my part. There is also a lot of debate, especially in the Twitter space, about was all of this preventable? And that we have not done enough, or we came in too late, into the game. And so if you just like to comment on it, was it preventable, or the dynamics were already set by the time the offer was made?
I mean, anything is preventable, right? Because people make decisions that
Yeah,
lead us to
yeah.
certain points. I would go back, I mean, I think the clearest way to have prevented this would have been, frankly, not to go forward with the referendum. The referendum having taken place, being a reality, of course, then it is, I think, we need to recognize, and we certainly foresaw, that there would be enormous pressure on the Prime Minister to respond. And we saw the resolutions passed one after the other in Parliament, calling on the Prime Minister to do a series of things, some of which were more symbolic, some of which were more active, and some of which may have even been drastic. So I think we need to see the actions that have taken place in that political context. You can't remove the political context from what has happened. And if the Prime Minister had not responded, I think we could have seen a scenario that was potentially far more disturbing than we would see now in terms of changes in Baghdad that would have been, I think, very unfortunate from an Iraqi standpoint and from a...
Yes, the gentleman there, please.
Yeah, Mohammed Salami from Arabian Gulf Center for Iranian Studies. Do you see Hashd al-Shabi is another version of Iranian Revolutionary Guard? Especially many Iranian officials started talking about creating another Revolutionary Guard in Iraq, Syria, and other places. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you probably know, the Iraqi parliament, I guess it was about a year ago, passed the Popular Mobilization Forces Law, which is essentially a very broad framework for incorporating PMF into the broader Iraqi security forces, and to ensure that they are responsible to the command and control of the commander-in-chief, the prime minister. Also to ensure that they are accountable under law, much as other parts of Iraqi security forces are accountable under law. Now, of course, the Popular Mobilization Forces encompass many, many forces. Many, as I alluded to in my remarks, are simply patriotic Iraqis responding to the Grand Ayatollah's call to come and combat ISIS at a critical moment. I think most Iraqis regard those including Sunni Iraqis, by the way, who I talk to frequently, regard those forces as legitimate Iraqi security forces. There are also these other groups, and we know their names, that were involved in killing Americans and others back after 2003, some of which are in fact designated terrorist organizations by the United States government. Those groups are, as I said, unlikely to be reconciled to Iraqi authority, heavily under the influence of Tehran. Those organizations, however the PMF law is implemented, and we're still in the implementation phase, and it's not clear how that's going to come out, those groups, I think, will remain a problem. I think when the Prime Minister was here in March, he alluded to his concerns about armed groups in a post-ISIS environment, and that armed groups that are not directly reporting to the Prime Minister, as the Iraqi security forces do, are essentially outlaw forces. And so that is a problem, a real challenge that the Iraqi authorities are going to have to face at a certain point after ISIS is defeated.
One last question. The lady here, please.
Thank you. I'm Prusha Hassan, a student, so certainly no expert. I'd like to ask about American stance on a unified Iraq going forward. I think the U.S. has established that it's looking to promote a unified Iraq, but in light of recent events in Kirkuk, it's also been established that the Kurds have not felt more marginalized, and divisiveness is an all-time high in decades. How feasible is this going forward? And if there is to be a unified Iraq with the mounting tension, what role would the Kurds play?
Yeah. So let me be clear about one thing, and I probably should have hit this harder in my remarks, but the United States is a partner of Iraq. And that means we're a partner of the government in Baghdad. We're a strong partner of the KRG. Those relationships continue. We expect that those partnerships will remain strong. Our intention is to deepen partnerships with both sides, but in an environment in which Baghdad and Erbil have a relationship that is reinforcing and that is of benefit to the citizens, whether you're in Kurdistan or whether you're in the rest of Iraq. Obviously, we are going through a period now that is very turbulent, both in those disputed areas and, frankly, in the Kurdistan region itself. So there is going to be a period of time where we're going to have to see how all of these actions and reactions play out and where things end up. Again, we are trying to very much to de-escalate, trying to find areas of dialogue, and we think establishing joint security in the disputed territories, it's been done before. There are patterns out there for doing this, is a way to start to rebuild some of that trust, that fabric between Baghdad and Erbil, recognizing that there are very raw feelings on both sides at this point. So we need to be realistic in the pace at which that can happen. We also think that both sides, both Baghdad and Erbil, have a tremendous amount of work to do in terms of governance, providing services for their citizens, providing effective leadership, and particularly as we move through an election cycle. So there are many, many issues that are on the plate of both governments. And I think, again, the long-term future and the long-term future of Baghdad-Erbil relations, Baghdad and Erbil will come back to that. I think at the moment, because of the environment, the atmosphere that has been created by this series of events, we're not in a place where that is possible now. So we put that on the shelf. They put that on the shelf. They can come back and talk about that another time. But in the meantime, trying to impress on both sides to not do things unilaterally, not simply to, whether it's a military movement, a referendum, or anything else, to do things that destabilize, that create this animus between the two sides that makes it so difficult to solve problems.
There is a lot of interest. I wish we can keep Mr. Pennington for another hour or two, but there are two terrific expert panels following this discussion with Mr. Pennington, so please stick around. At this time, I would like you to join me in thanking Mr. Pennington for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
At a critical turning point in its political trajectory and economic trajectory, we are very much similar, as Mr. Pennington said, like in 2008, 2010, the military success against Al-Qaeda created a political opening to strike a new political compact. That moment was missed, and we can spend hours debating what went wrong, who was responsible. We are where we are. And today, I think we are facing a similar turning point with the anti-ISIS fight winding down. Iraq is at this, faces this challenge of constructing a new political compact. And to discuss this important topic, we have assembled a terrific panel of Iraqi experts whose articles, op-eds, tweets, Facebook postings have become reference points, at least for me, to learn about Iraq, its people, its complexity, its politics. So it's my pleasure to welcome them today. And in terms of biographies, you all have their professional biographies in your program booklet. I will just say a few quick words about each of them before turning to the discussion. I'll start with the lady in the group, Rasha Al-Aqidi. She's a researcher at Al-Misbar Studies and Research Center in Dubai. Her research interest focuses on Islamist group, radical ideology, and identity politics. She's a native of Mosul, Iraq, and her writings about the political and social dynamics in that city have been invaluable again, at least for me, in understanding the ISIS phenomenon. You can read her smart opinions, analysis in The National, The American Interest, and Inside Iraqi Politics. Ambassador Faisal Al-Istrabadi is the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University Bloomington and a professor in the practice of international law and diplomacy. He has a book coming up in November 2017 titled The Future of ISIS, Regional and International Implications. I think I pre-ordered it, and so I'm making here a plug for your upcoming book.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Commercial.
Dr. Abbas Qadim is a senior fellow at SAI's Foreign Policy Institute and is a president of the Institute of Shia Studies. He focuses his research on socio-political dynamics in Iraq, Iran, and the Persian Gulf. One of his books, which I highly recommend, is Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 Revolution and the Founding of the Modern State. And last but not least is Dr. Bilal Wahab, is a Sarif Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he focuses on governance in the Iraqi Kurdish region and in Iraq as a whole. He established the Center for Development and Natural Resources at the American University of Iraq in Sulaimani, which in my opinion is one of the premier high educational institutions in Iraq and in the Middle East. So now, in terms of political compact discussion, if we look at how things have evolved in Iraq, and you might agree or disagree with me, I think there are 4 key planks that have always been present in Iraqi national compact. One is national reconciliation, and people have gone back and forth on top-down, bottom-up, but national reconciliation is one key plank. The second is democratic federalism, and again, how well institutionalized, how successful it has been, the failures, and we can discuss that. Third is political inclusion, and we can talk about about political inclusion, not only in terms of political entities or along sectarian lines or along ethnic lines, but political inclusion as a principle, as a founding principle of a political partnership among the different components in Iraq. And fourth is a fair and rational oil policy. So where do you think is the status of the Iraqi political compact today, using these 4 planks as indicators, benchmarks in discussing where we are today? I will start with Ambassador Al-Istrabadi.
You know, I always prefer to go last,
Okay.
but I will start. You know, I think a place to start that's actually useful, I think, is to say, do we actually have a political compact in Iraq? It's not clear to me that we do. Maybe we should have 15 years after the decline or the fall of the previous regime. But it isn't clear to me, and I'm not talking about, we heard today about the, Baghdad Erbil was a constantly recurrent phrase, or words was earlier today. I'm not just talking about Arab and Kurd. Within the Kurdish polity, is there a vision for a way forward in Iraq, whether it's for independence or not? Within the political class, within the Shi'i political class, is there a common vision? Within the Sunni political class, is there a common vision? I don't think so. I mean, so I think that we have failed to develop, in my opinion, a modus vivendi, even, a meeting ground. My hope is that 2017 might have been the year for that, 2018, as we head into what I hope will be the federal elections, to begin to develop some consensus on a way forward. I think that's the first real question that has to be answered. I can take apart some of these on the 4 points you've made, and on some of them we do better than others. Democratic federalism, let me start with that. Well, how broadly or narrowly do you want to define democracy or federalism? On the federalism piece, by and large, at least before the 25th of September, the affairs of the Kurdistan region were left by Baghdad to themselves, between Erbil and Sulaymaniyah. We've all become accustomed to talking about Baghdad and Erbil. But actually, I think we have to start talking about Baghdad, Erbil, and Sulaymaniyah. And not because I'm advocating the division of the KRG or anything like that. I know that's been, at least in social media. But simply because, as a fact, Sulaymaniyah has become a player, appears to have become a real player on its own. And I think we should acknowledge that, at least while it remains true. If it remains true indefinitely, fine. If not, fine. Democracy, well, I mean, we've had elections. If you want a narrow definition of elections, we have had elections. In fact, we have had the federal elections so far have always gone off on time. We have had the peaceful transitions of power from, granted, all within the same party, at least in respect to the prime minister, but nonetheless, from twice we've had a peaceful transfer of power. These are positive things. So if I take democracy to be a process, we are in the process. Have we, Iraq doesn't look like Sweden, but it is a very different place than Saddam Hussein's Iraq. That's progress. I think on national reconciliation, we have really dropped the ball collectively. We have done very little on national reconciliation. And I think that comes into political inclusion. I think the two are very closely related. And I think as far as a rational oil policy, I'm not an expert on energy, so I should stop there. Thank you.
Russia.
Okay. First of all, I would just want to comment something on the ongoing events in Kirkuk. As someone from Mosul, I don't think that we should forget the role that KRG played, a very positive one in welcoming the IDPs. My family, for one, left for KRG. They were welcomed with open arms, such as hundreds of thousands of people. And the same kind of welcome they also experienced in Karbala, which was kind of surprising. Interestingly, it's not what they experienced in Baghdad. And I think that kind of reflects something about how politics are kind of manufactured sometimes, and how biases begin and where they begin. What the referendum, for one, if we're going to be talking about where the Iraqi politic process is today.
We will get there.
Yes.
Okay.
This relates to the point. I think one thing it reflected in the seconds what Ambassador Strabadi was talking about, the different opinions of how we perceive our political process to begin with. So for 2003, I think from the Western perspective was about removing an authoritarian dictatorship. It turns out that that was not necessarily the deal. 2003 also reflected differences about the essence of the Iraqi state, the foundation of it. The problem was not 1979 when Saddam became president, it was rather 1921 how Iraq was formed. So I think it was kind of unrealistic even before that to presume that the Kurdish population would easily become a part of Iraq. I also think there's a common narrative I'm seeing, at least on social media, that who can blame the Kurds from wanting to split from Iraq? I find that quite offensive to both Iraqis and to the Kurds. Offensive to the Iraqis because I think we've been very, very resilient. We have fought the most radical organization probably in modern history. The country has gone through war after war. We've been through facing this jihadist surge since 2004. And it's offensive to the Kurds to presume that their cause or their seek for this national state has something to do with just Iraq being prosperous. It's more than that. Also, regarding the same point, and this kind of also touches on national reconciliation, I agree little has been done. I was very optimistic up until March when I saw that, at least speaking in Mosul's context, there was a complete different narrative that was starting in the city that had been absent. Finally, after 13, 14 years, the people of Mosul started understanding the differences between the marja'iyat. Sistani became this national figure that people were very proud of. The figure of the Iraqi Special Operational Forces were heroes. Mosul is not the kind of city that necessarily celebrates its military leaders in the common fashion, but portraits of certain military figures like Abdul Wahab al-Sa'adi, they were installed all over the city. That had never happened, and I was very happy to see that first step. And then the liberation of the West Side started, where there was more destruction. And I think that narrative kind of took a step back into how that battle was played out and the amount of destruction, devastation, and civilian loss. So what is the government doing about this now? So far, nothing. In fact, it has kind of left the space open in Mosul and allowed the militias that it promised would not enter the city to enter. They're not simply holding just the ground at the moment. What's happening is they've begun to extort some of the civilians for money, and we have this replay of the 2006 scenario once again. This is also very problematic, and it could have long-term consequences. And finally, my point that I think relates to all of them is the IDPs. We still have hundreds of thousands of people without homes. My worst fear is that the concept of the refugee camp and the tent becomes the norm in Iraq. We don't want that. It's never happened in the history of Iraq, and I would think it's very shameful for that to happen when we finally have a democracy. Thanks.
Thank you. Bilal, you are the energy expert on this panel. So
I'll try to be.
yes, no, but you are also.
Thank you.
Founded the center on, and so if you can comment on this issue of oil policy and where the failures have been.
Sure. Here's my take. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. I think in a post-Saddam Iraq, there was a legal and institutional vacuum. And yet there was an opportunity that emerged. The opportunity was the abundance of cash, both cash that was sitting in foreign banks, Iraqi currency that was sitting in foreign banks, being repatriated back to the country, but also oil prices, especially around 2007, oil prices became record high, and so the Iraqi government was awash with cash. Record budgets were achieved basically in post-Saddam Iraq. What that basically gave us a new form of political compact based not on institutions, based not on rule of law, but based on patronage. I think this is how the formula works, and this is a very economic-centric model. And it doesn't mean that this is the only model. I think this was an emerging model that was built upon a system that Saddam Hussein built, but under Saddam Hussein, oil revenues were highly centralized and therefore used very efficiently to run the government, and when oil prices were low, then create the kind of security measures that were needed to preserve the regime. After Saddam Hussein, this pyramid was broken into smaller pieces, into smaller networks. The mechanism was in place, but the players and the operatives were different. And basically, the game of town, the political game, the new political compact became the following. There is no private sector. The infrastructure is in shambles, but the government is very, very rich. So if you want to access wealth, if you want to matter, then you need to be in government. And to be in government, okay, you don't have, rule of law is weak, institutions are weak, but we have frequent elections, as both of my colleagues and previous speakers mentioned. So elections, and winning elections is very easy, and it's also very easy to sell as now we're democratic because we are holding elections in the absence of good governance, in the absence of effective institutions, policy-making institutions, but also conflict resolution institutions. So pay to play, and so people got into the first round of politics. And that's why one of the main problems of Iraq moving forward is that the group of actors and parties that got into government the first time have managed to stay there. You can call them stuck there. Why? Because then once you're there, then basically you loop the machine to win the next election. And that was very easy to, all you need is do a simple math. How many votes do you need? How many people do you need? A ministry in the Iraqi government and also in the KRG government became a siphoning off machine, an operation in which, through that ministry, you hire loyalists or you create loyalists. You pay your cronies, so whatever private sector that exists in Iraq, is only one step away from the public sector. So then that way you loop that part of the economy as well. In Baghdad, it was less so. In KRG, definitely more so, because in KRG you had more centralization of authority. In Baghdad, it was more diffused. That's why in the KRG, you see more economic development and more, high rises than you see in the rest of the country. But this feedback loop, this pay to play, basically brought back the same faces to power. And this was, I think what we were seeing. That's why the institutions were weak. That's why rule of law was weak. That's why the legislature was weak. That's why the executive had the upper hand, because that's where the money was, despite the parliament being, nominally in charge of the money. This system, however, faced two major shocks in 2014. A, it was ISIS, and B, it was plummeting oil prices. And the way that the KRG and Baghdad responded to these two shocks were different. In Iraq, we have a bifurcation. On the one hand, you have this move towards, in Iraqi lingo, it's called Haraka Madaniya, like a civilian movement or civilian political parties. It's a code name for liberal or even secular. It's a move away from, the religious parties, often turbaned political figures who have been in charge and have really shown very little in terms of good governance and services to their societies. So the alternative is this civilian as opposed to religious government or religious-based government, which is, again, a code word for secular parties. So this is one trend. But the war against ISIS gave us kind of a boost to the religious establishment by way of the very popular mobilization units. So I think for Iraqi politics, that's what we need to see. Which side is going to win? The one that says we need to provide governance and services and be citizen-focused, or the popular mobilization units that have become the protectors of the system. This is in Baghdad. In KRG, the response was different. We had a legitimacy issue for the government. Elections were not held in time. The presidency was extended over and over again. A future of Kurdish politics was not in sight. The dispute over the presidency shut down the parliament. 2 years later, people realized, well, actually, life can go on without parliament, without that main democratic institution. So how do you build legitimacy? How do you bring back an important issue that galvanizes society? They went for the referendum. I'll end it there.
Abbas, get up from here.
Thank you, Randa, for your effort here, and thanks to everyone for coming. I normally like to stick to the points that are given in the agenda because they are there for a reason. So I will go with them.
We didn't, right?
No, you didn't. Just kidding.
He just did like this.
No, they've done a great job because the context here helps. Anyway, so reconciliation, I will take them one by one. I remind Bilal was here and Randa also about, 2 years ago? And we sat here and we talked about reconciliation. Right. And one of our fears is that we will come again later years and we will still talk about reconciliation. And we will say the same thing. And the thing that we said and we still are suffering from, the problems with reconciliation in Iraq is that we are not doing it right. First of all, the government is doing the reconciliation when the government is part of the problem. The government does not still like to seek expertise from real experts, international and national experts. And reconciliation is one of the jobs that are allocated to a certain party. Bilal just mentioned earlier that those ministries or agencies normally are valuable in as much as they give money to the parties. And this is not a big post, so it is given to the least important member of the party that gets that job. means the least experienced and the guy who is not going to do a good job, most likely. It's not the oil ministry, it's just the Ministry of Reconciliation or the Commission on Reconciliation, and it ends up being in the back burner. So that's a problem. The reconciliation also, it's done among politicians and parties. So they do great reconciliation when they give another ministry to another corrupt politician. And guess what? You will never run out of corrupt politicians that need to be given ministries. Where are the people and the communities and the society in this reconciliation? It's not there. The last attempt at reconciliation, I was in Iraq back in May, June. They went to do some reconciliation among tribes in Karbala. Last I checked, Karbala never had any clashes between their, the tribes. And when Mr. Maliki and Mr. Ma'soom, the president and the vice president went, they created a problem among the Bani Hassan tribes because they went to the wrong sheikhs and they thought they were the sheikhs, okay? And that's one of the problems when President Ma'soom had his own daughter to be his advisor, and she gave him a bad advice on who was the Sheikh of Bani Hassan. I was sitting in the Madif of Muthanna Hatam al-Hassan, and he was fuming. How did they go to these guys who are not even from Bani Hassan, he says. So anyway, they went to do reconciliation to a place where needed no reconciliation, and they created a problem. Now we need to go and do reconciliation. So it reminds me of that joke that says, heat some water and put it in the heater. Now, federalism. Federalism is another problem in Iraq. It's becoming, basically federalism is in the eye of the beholder. For Mr. Masoud Barzani, federalism means he gets his cut from the budget, and then he comes when the next budget is passed to get another check, and nobody asks him in the interval. For the provinces, there is a city council made of 1, 2, or 3 parties, and they want their cut, and nobody talks to them. And then when you give them the money, especially in the provinces, they cannot do the job, and they end up returning the money because it's still complicated. Iraq is still, most of the laws are central. And then, so if you want to build a school, you have to get the land from the Ministry of Municipalities, and you have to get the permission from the Ministry of Education, and then you have to get the city council to decide on that. And it depends on which party each one of these belong and where the school is to be built. It ends up not being built. And that's a problem. So, and the other level of bad problems with reconciliation is that you are talking about provinces. Until 13 years ago, 14 years ago, none of them had even a police chief from the province. I'm from Najaf, and I don't recall any time in my lifetime in Iraq, 24 years, to have ever had a governor from Najaf or a mayor from Najaf or any high-level official. And the few ones who were there who were promoted, they were high-level Ba'athists, and they were chased away after 2003. So they are not available. So you are really going to people who never ran a school, and you gave them billions of dollars to govern a province, and they had no idea how to do it. That's a problem with, and constitutionally, the law, even the institutions, federalism, you have to have every province to have its own sort of mini state with judiciary, with bureaucracy, with administration, with legislature, with all of that is done. So when it's not there, you cannot really talk about federalism and give powers to those. It ends up giving powers to individuals, not to provinces. Inclusion, I agree with Dr. Esther Abadi that it is really dovetailing with reconciliation because you reconciliate by including people. That's another place where I think Iraqis are not getting it right or understanding it. Our problem is not that we are excluding groups of ethnicities or sects. The Kurds are represented very well. They have their share, about 30% of the positions. The Sunni Arabs are getting that. The Shia are getting that. The problem is that all of these positions are going to 2, 3, 4 parties from each group, and the rest of Iraqis are not included. So positions always were recycled among the same politicians, One day you see him a minister of finance, another day you see him a minister of interior, a third day you see him a minister of transportation, and I'm not talking about Bayan Jabr. And many of those are, basically, they end up doing everything, the same groups of people. And they end up not looking for fresh ideas, for people who actually have things to contribute. The vast majority of Iraqis are excluded, not because you are not excluded because you are a Shia, or because you are a Kurd, or because you are a Sunni. You are excluded because you are not a member of X, Y, or Z party. And that really applies to 90% of Iraqis. And that is the real problem that when we talk about exclusion, we need to look at it. We should not look at, are we excluding the Kurds, the Sunnis, or the Shia? None of these groups, as groups, are excluded for their identity. Energy, this is the curse of Iraq. I mean, I wrote once a paper about Iraq's rich state and poor society. And that is a problem that we are dealing with. The revenue, all of the revenue from oil, which is more than 90 to 95% of the revenue in Iraq is coming from oil, goes to the government, and then it ends up being squandered, wasted, stolen, you name it, all of that, and then nothing really is seen anywhere on the ground, or in terms of services, in terms of institutions, in terms of state building, infrastructure building. And that's a problem. Iraq needs not just to manage its oil resources and energy resources well, but Iraq needs to scale back on its dependence on oil. And that is the problem. Iraq's macroeconomics right now, the entire theory, forget capitalism, Marxism, socialism, all of the isms, it's very simple. The Iraqi economist and government, his entire macroeconomic theory is dig oil, sell it, and pray that prices don't go down. That's the entire macroeconomics of Iraq. That's not a way to do any justice to a country like Iraq. The monarchy did not really rely on energy resources. I mean, it was just not until 1950s that Iraq got 50% of the revenue sharing. Before that, it was even very little. Iraq was selling agricultural products. It was selling even products that are made in Iraq, all kinds of, and markets were buying from Iraq, from Europe to Asia, etc. That was all being killed after the 1958. And then after the nationalization of oil, 1972, 73, the process, and after the rise of the oil prices, 1974, where the prices went fourfold up, then the state just forgot about all of this and then ended up leaving everything and becoming completely dependent on oil. So we need to go back and have a government that understands a thing or two about diversifying the economy and making the oil revenue as a strategic backup or a strategic supplement to the actual work of the people, and capitalize on human resources, starting from doing education, which is a disaster right now in Iraq, and then moving up to create a human capital that really contributes to open up the markets, redo the investment laws, everything in order to have an economy that is diverse, and then stop being at the mercy of international oil prices that Iraq has no hand in setting.
Thank you. Now, one of the most important battles that, in my opinion, Iraq will be waging in the future, and which is really a short-term to medium-term to long-term challenge to Iraq's political compact. And this is something that's shared by other countries neighboring Iraq, is to varying degrees over different entities, is the status of the Hashd. And whether they are properly integrated into the ISF or they become an Iraqi version of something, there are people who are saying IRGC, some people are saying Hezbollah, but that's a challenge that is, I think Iraqis are aware of. You mentioned, the different militias. I come from Lebanon. I have seen the consequences of not dealing with this challenge early on and let it linger and linger and linger, and then it becomes extremely hard to, deal with it. So I wonder whether you can shed some insights about where you think Baghdad is going with this issue going forward. I know there is a debate even inside the Shiite community about what to do with the Hashd going forth. And I know there is a whole spectrum of Hashd, some that are pro-Sistani, some that are. I know that there are ideas that are being, discussed about what's going to happen to the Hashd after ISIS. Some will be given money to go back to their communities. Some would need to be integrated into the ISIS. It's just if you can share with us some of your insights of what you hear, the discussions in Iraq and in Baghdad is about dealing with the Hashd going forward, and maybe ideas that you guys have about what is the best way to deal with the Hashd, given the diversity of the Hashd. And I'm opening it up here. I'm not going to designate somebody to, answer, but who would like to take the first crack at it? Please.
For the end game for the Hashd at the moment. They're holding land, for example, territory that had been liberated by the Iraqi forces. And will they stay there for how long? Is there an alternative? Are they training local forces or Iraqi forces, not even local forces, proper forces, police, to hold these territories? Will they be deployed in certain areas? Will the Hashd withdraw? There's absolutely nothing clear at this moment. I think we're still in a fight against ISIS. I think there are a lot of more complications that it's kind of hard, also due to the popularity of the PMUs, to discuss this quite openly. It's kind of, we're kind of in a hard spot where if they would withdraw from these territories that they are causing some problems in, will that be dangerous for the city that is still vulnerable to ISIS threats? This is also a point we have to think of thoroughly. I personally haven't heard of anything, but leave it for the moment. Let's not talk about this right now. We have more dire issues. So I'm curious to see what the panelists have heard or suggest. Faisal?
I'll be happy to be corrected by my colleagues, but my impression is the same as yours, that there is really not an ongoing serious public discussion about the PMUs. In my view, and it has nothing to do with there's a lot of loose talk about Iran and its role in Iraq these days especially, which I think is unhelpful and mistaken. Regardless, if the Hashd were wholly hermetically sealed off from Iran and every other regional power, they constitute a challenge to the state of Iraq. Because, although technically now, thanks to the actions of Parliament, many of the PMUs report technically to the Prime Minister. In fact, some of the most important groups, the best equipped, best trained groups, don't de facto report to the Prime Minister, and this is a real problem. Now, I understand the Hashd has played a very important role in rolling back ISIL, although my understanding, and there are people who know much more about the Marji'iyya and Najaf than I do on this panel, but my understanding is that the original fatwa of the Grand Ayatollah Sayyid al-Sistani was explained by his representatives as meaning that people should volunteer for the armed and security forces, not that there should exist outside the state these organizations, which is unfortunately de facto what we have now ended up with. So this is good, but on the other hand, as is the premise of your questions, the leaders of these movements are extremely popular, heroic in fact, and it is going to be a real challenge for, I think, in particular, the Shia religious parties to deal with. with, I think it's, I hope, the support of the Shia religious establishment of Najaf. So if I could comment about one thing from the previous question, and that is what Dr. Abbas said, that Dr. Kadhim said, that you know, in a federalist society, you should have each province as a mini-state. This actually made my point, because that, of course, is one model of federalism, which is a symmetric federalism that we have in the United States, for instance. But, of course, there are asymmetric models of federalism, and in which you could have, for instance, the only federated region is the KRG, which is, in fact, what we have now. Only the KRG is a federated region. Everywhere else is ruled directly by Baghdad, more or less, which is also a perfectly legitimate model of asymmetric federalism. My point is, it just dovetails, I thought, very nicely with my point. We don't agree on the term federalism. When the Iraqi political class use the term federalism, we don't actually agree on what we mean. We've not 15 years on almost, we've yet to define the term.
Dr. Kadhim.
I think Bilal wanted
It's
to
okay.
mention something.
Yeah, but no, I want you to quickly follow up, if it's okay with Bilal, on the issue of the marja'iyya. I consider you the top marja'iyya expert in this country. And so where does the marja'iyya...
At least on that part of the stage.
No, in the country. Where do you think the marja'iyya stands today vis-a-vis the Hashd? Do they see them as, you know, I mean, as they have created something that they know might be a danger in the future to the idea of a united, unitary Iraq? I mean, I'm not saying they are regretting their decision, but what is, I mean, is there a discussion, you know, inside the marja'iyya about what to do going forward? I know there has been this proposal, they will issue another fatwa, Sayyid Sistani will issue another fatwa calling on them to go home, you know. And we know that he has always referred to them as volunteers rather than, you know, just to keep this idea of, you know, you are volunteer, once the fight is over, you have to go home. I wonder whether, even if Sayyid Sistani issue that fatwa, whether many of them will heed that call. But your perspective.
Well, thank you for your vote of confidence. I agree with Dr. Estrabadi when he says that the original idea of the fatwa was not to create a separate group from the Iraq Armed Forces. Indeed, the fatwa, as it was stated from the Friday prayer sermon, was calling on Iraqis to join the Iraqi Armed Forces. I was in Iraq when that process was unfolding. The problem is there was no armed forces that could take those volunteers. Seeing people, young men from various areas initially in the south and middle Euphrates, etc., going to the bases of the military and not finding anybody with a bottle of water to meet them in that July heat, and they go back home. Nobody would take them, and they even took their weapons from their homes. And then that was the opportunity for certain groups that already existing as skeletons, and then they said, you want to go fight, we will take you. So, and then they took them as part of the Kata'ib Hezbollah or Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq or the Badr, which was, basically Badr disarmed and went to become political from the get-go after they arrived. And then they regrouped themselves before the creation of some 40 groups later on that were completely different entities for that fighting ISIS purpose. Now, I did speak with Sayyid Sistani. I had the honor of meeting him more than once, and I spoke with him right after the fatwa and asked him about it as a historian. And then he basically said there was no other option to save Iraq. And that's what caused him. He did not issue that fatwa happily. He issued it very reluctantly because one of his words is that I'm going to meet Allah with the blood of these kids because they're going to die. And the fatwa is part of this killing. And so it was a very profound moment when he was talking about it. Problem is, this, back to the core of your question, is a debate being held now. There is a big debate being held now. And recently there was some kind of a rumor being sort of circulated that Sayyid Sistani is going to dismantle this. So what did the Marja'iyya do? They unearthed a fatwa from an earlier, 1 year earlier, and then it was just a fatwa. Somebody sent a letter, and they sent him the answer, and the answer was in the form of a fatwa. So they took it from their records and published it. And it says the rationale for the assembly of the Hashd, of course, they don't call it Hashd, they call it volunteers. And the rationale for the fatwa was that there was an existential threat to Iraq, and the threat is still there. So the time is not right for talking about reversing the fatwa. And that is the issue here. Now, the debate at the popular level, there is another debate, because we are talking about not just the Hashd that is fighting in Mosul or in, nowadays in West Anbar and other places. There are also people in the name of the Hashd in the cities going around and doing things that are purely unrelated to the fight of ISIS and to the Hashd. Many of them are things including criminal things, and the Prime Minister mentioned it. That they kidnap certain people, they do a lot of party politics with the force of guns, etc. And they do force certain favors from, or extract certain, well, not extract, but extort sometimes, certain favors from political, either political figures or from administrative, bureaucratic figures in universities, etc. So there is a lot of problems, or there are many problems that are going on in the name of the Hashd, and people are unhappy with them. Also, if you walk anywhere in Iraq, you will see that there are places where they are in full control. And I think to bring one last thing to close with is what Russia was talking about, and also Ms. Aqidi and Dr. Esther Abadi on that. I think the real way and the right way to handle it is for the government. The government has a law from the parliament that was passed. And that law gives the government, gives the prime minister an absolute freedom in restructuring this group any way he likes. And then he will be the commander of that, including the way to decide who fights where and decides all of the commanders of the units, restructure it any way he wants. And then anybody who is out of this plan will be considered out of the law. The government needs to take that law and implement it as soon as possible, and then we will not need to worry about having a debate that is just on everybody's whim.
Bilal.
Let me just finish where Dr. Abbas, let me just start where he finished. I think that is possible in a more ideal Iraq, where the prime minister actually not only has such intentions, well, I believe he does, but whether he can actually implement that kind of plan. Let's not forget that, a few months ago, one group, the followers of Sayyid Muqtada al-Sadr, stormed the parliament. One group has the power of storming the Iraqi parliament. How likely is it for this parliament to pass a law to rein in the influence of such a group? Right now, call it however you want to evaluate the Kurdish referendum, one mistake or one bad outcome is that it has united all of the Iraqis and given them a cause to unite, which is against the KRG. But these groups are far from being united, both institutionally, in terms of the loyalty, and their command and control structure. Yes, some would rather serve a greater interest. And you said this very rightly, that even in the past, before the Hashd was instituted, some of these militias that existed basically played the role of not law enforcement, but in the absence of law enforcement, in the absence of the independent judicial framework, they were basically enforcing contracts. One way in which you can conduct business in parts of Iraq is to have, a militia that, enforces the contract. You can call that corruption, you can call that organized crime, or you can call that the cost of business. And so there are all of these opportunities that, this rosy scenario, allow me to say, could go wrong. And I think that is the challenge of how do we make sure that it does not go wrong. I think that's a greater challenge for Baghdad, for especially the Shia rule than it is, the Shia parties, than it is for anyone else. Because there is the question of disbandment, but there's also the question of political evolution, of them becoming political parties and saying, okay, we have, we're the heroes. And yes, you're right, they are the heroes, in the eyes of the Iraqi society. I say that they're quite popular. So what do you do with that kind of populism? You don't go home, right? You want to cash on it.
Yes.
And we have elections coming up, in spring. So, Badr has already made that transition, and that's the model. And, Hadi al-Amiri, who is the head of Badr, is one of the main contenders of Prime Minister Abadi. One of the reasons why this town is so supportive of Prime Minister Abadi is because, Maliki or Hadi al-Amiri would be possible alternatives. At least, so a guy with a suit is better than a guy in khaki. I mean, so this is, I think, part of the reality. To tie this question of PMUs, oh, and by the way, when you were talking about this, I just had a scary thought. Now in Kurdistan, there is a lot of people are baffled by what happened. How all of this territory was basically lost within 48 hours, and people are very, very angry at their own government. They express it different ways. But I was just thinking, what if someone announces for a Kurdish Popular Mobilization Unit? Imagine how terrible that will be. But that was just me, having a bad idea, bad thought. Don't listen to me. To tie this back to my initial remarks about my little, oil-related patronage politics theorem.
It's not little.
Okay. Thank you. If there is a realistic chance for demobilization, and not only for the Hasht, but for these, tens of thousands who join the security forces, it would be through creating a real economy and a real private sector. The government basically is over capacity. They cannot hire more people. And right now, the easiest job that an Iraqi young person can get, and the majority of the Iraqi population are under 30, would be to go and join the security forces, whether it's Peshmerga, whether it's security, police, Hashd, or Iraqi army. That is the easier job to get, and it pays better. The government itself is overpopulated. In the KRG, for example, a population of 5 million, the government pays the salaries of 1.4 million. About 800,000 people are on government payroll. A mosque in a village had 5 people whose job was to call for prayer, and actually they put a machine that does it for you. It's made in China, so the 5 people don't even need to do that. There is a Department of Transportation that has a department for trains. I'm 37 years old, and I haven't seen a Kurdish train yet. So you just put people in government offices, so it's just there's overcapacity. So where do you go? You go for the other gift that Iraq keeps giving: war, conflict. And if you're holding a hammer, every problem starts looking like a nail. So the real challenge goes back to how do we break this patronage politics, lack of weak institutions, weak governance dynamic, in which we actually create opportunities for the young people, for the young boys and girls who want to work, especially men, who can actually find an alternative to any of these myriads of security offices that basically are very ready and easy to give job, and then we can realistically talk about demobilization and a peaceful way out for these young and now seasoned fighters.
Okay, I hate to keep you there and put you on the spot, but I think I need to come back to you immediately after this opening. Well, the last question I would like all of us to deliberate, all of you to deliberate, is this issue of managing the aftermath of the KRG referendum, the operation in Kirkuk. we all heard Mr. Pennington. It looks like the United States at this moment is focused on deconfliction, does not see a space now for this big dialogue that needs to happen between Erbil and Baghdad on the future of their relationship. I was in Erbil during the referendum, and based on personal anecdote, based on personal observation I have seen with talking with people, there was real happiness, real joy, you know, in the streets of Erbil. And it crossed, you know, groups, political affiliation. It was PUK, KDP, Goran. I mean, there was this really feeling of having finally achieved this long-awaited dream. And so now the political debate is stuck between this, you know, unity and territorial unity and the importance of keeping it, Baghdad's narrative, and then the secession and the dream for independence, which is the KRG narrative. And how are we going? And these seems to be mutually exclusive, and they are mutually exclusive at this point. So how can we bridge this gap? How can we, what kind of process need to be put in place to start bridging the gap? Is there a room for it? You know? And if that's the case, who is going to convene this process? The US seems to be reluctant to play this role. So if the US is not planning to play this role, who can play this role? I mean, can it be Iraqi-led? Can it be Iraqi, you know, Baghdad and the KRG, you know, talking with each other? And I don't know when is that possible, especially after Kirkuk. So take it from here, Bilal, and then we'll turn it over to the rest.
Let me just start by saying that's also an emotional question for me. The past 2 days have been very, very difficult. I think the Kurds could have at least chosen between a political defeat or a political loss and a military loss. But I'm sad to say that it's both. And the lack of communication, you know, between the Kurdish leadership and the people, just telling them what happened, that is missing. That so far has been missing. There are a lot of accusations. There's a lot of silence, none of which helps. So when we talk about conflict, I'm really worried about the simmering tension.
Exactly.
Because we have two contrasts. On the one hand, you describe the mood of the people. What happened is, you know, regardless of the political calculations, regardless of how we evaluate the outcome, the consequences of the referendum, the Kurds of Iraq went to the ballots, despite the risk and the existence of the KRG, remember, depends on international support, and they heard that the world was against the Kurdish move, and yet they braved that and went and they voted, and the majority, right, 93%, about 93% voted yes for a Kurdish state. That should not be, that will not be canceled out by a military operation. That was the voice of the people. Right? Again, as a political movement, that's a whole thing. As politics, that's a different question. But that was the voice of the people. That's one. And that was a jubilant move in which, you know, despite the disunity of the Kurdish House, everyone came to vote, including the opposition parties who were opposing the referendum until 24 hours before the poll. And yet this rise of nationalism was really punched in the gut within 3 weeks, 2 weeks, with this military and political failure of the Kurdish leadership. I am personally yet to hear a convincing argument or a convincing explanation, a story of what is going on. The Peshmerga can fight better than this. The Kurdish politicians can negotiate a better deal than this. Why is there such a failure? Why is there such a lack of transparency going on? And then also the pendulum, how far is the pendulum going to move back? Are the Iraqi forces pushing back the KRG and the Peshmerga to the 2014 borders, the pre-ISIS borders, or all the way to 2003? Or there are actually talks about all the way to 1990, right? Exploiting the Kurdish weakness, because going back to the question of how much is Prime Minister Abadi in control, I think that's a real question. The momentum of the forces is there. They can move forward. There is lack of communication. Chain of command in KRG is breaking apart. That unity that the referendum gave us was very short-lived. So it's actually quite possible for the Iraqi forces, in the absence of international intervention, to roll back all of the KRG achievements back to the 1990 borders. Now, who does this help, given that kind of voice? Who will then represent that voice? Who will represent that kind of ambition that was elevated? The Kurds were promised an independent country. And then within 3 weeks, they're losing what they have gained, through blood and through treasure and through diplomacy and through international support. I think there will be lots of grievances inside the Kurdish community about how to deal with this. And I think this is both dangerous on the Kurdish part, in terms of both exploding and imploding. But I think there's also an opportunity for the United States and for external forces to actually come in and meet and force both sides, even force both sides, I would say, to negotiate. Because
by both sides, you mean Baghdad and
Baghdad
Erbil?
and Erbil.
All right.
And because I still believe that in Iraq, in the absence, I go back to my initial point, in the absence of conflict resolution institutions. Look at the oil question. The KRG says the Constitution gives me all the right to do everything that I'm doing. And Baghdad says, no, the Constitution gives me all the right that I'm doing. If it was in a country that had a constitutional court, they would go in front of a committee of judges and they will solve the problem, who's right and who's wrong, and they go home. We don't have that kind of court that people believe in, and therefore it's matter of balance of power, not balance of rights and laws. For example, when the KRG was just finding oil and didn't have a pipeline to export it, it said yes to Iraqi requests. When they built their own pipeline, they basically had a new interpretation of the Constitution and they went their own way. Prime Minister Maliki, he needed Kurdish oil, so he said yes to revenue sharing according to Kurdish demands. When an oil field in Basra came online and he had more production and oil prices were going up, he started going tough on the KRG. It's a balance of power. You can't let Iraq's breadwinning institution, because oil is an institution, to be subject to balance of power, changing dynamics, international prices, and whims. And until we actually resolve these issues, and then we prove that Iraqis cannot do it on their own, these questions will linger unless it's a prisoner's dilemma. And the way you solve a prisoner's dilemma is by having intervention.
Thank you. I need to turn it over to the audience, but Faisal, you have been trying to, speak here. And if you can comment on this particular question quickly, please, before I turn.
Just very quickly. I mean, I think that, first of all, I absolutely agree with everything Bilal has just said. And I think that all of my colleagues have said the fundamental problem in both Baghdad and Erbil and Sulaymaniyah is we have failed to build institutions of governance. Never mind the rule of law, just institutions of governance. I find it, the questions, Bilal, that you've just rattled off, it is incredible to me that I've come 3 weeks after the referendum to the conclusion that the Kurdish leadership, at least in Erbil, didn't ask itself before the referendum, what were they going to do on the 26th of September? Now, from the Baghdadi perspective, the shock of, and this is something that I actually warned about at an MEI event in 2012, that the Kurds, by having a referendum on independence without actually declaring independence, would cause an immediate legitimacy problem in the country. Now, the difference is the Kurds didn't do it the right way. They did it in a way, they held the referendum in disputed territories. They didn't have international monitors. Masoud Barzani said he would refuse to negotiate with Baghdad before the referendum. He would only negotiate after the referendum. So they did it the wrong way. They didn't do it the way it was done in South Sudan, where negotiations were held over the years, and then in 2011 they held a referendum after everything else had been put into place. So it was very easy for Iraq to say, correctly, this is unconstitutional and illegal, and devastating from a Kurdish point of view for the international community, including the United Nations, to say, this is illegitimate. And this is where we are. The question for me is, as an Iraqi, and an Iraqi who believes on the voluntary union, federal union of Iraq from Fao to Duhok, are the, let me call them Baghdadis, but by that I mean the people outside the KRG. Are the Baghdadis going to hold their leadership? We've had one party with 3 prime ministers now since 2005. Are the Baghdadis going to hold their leadership for squandering the resources of the country? Something like $1 trillion, the budget of Iraq over the last 8 years approximates $1 trillion. For anybody who's traveled to Iraq, tell me where it went. Are the Baghdadis going to hold the same political parties they've been voting for 15 years now? Are they going to hold them to account for the rise of ISIL, for the loss of 40% of the country, for the blood and treasure lost in regaining, and we've not completed the task yet? Or are they going to keep voting for the same people who give them the same tired slogans? And by the same token, are the people of Kurdistan, of Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, going to hold their leaderships responsible for putting at risk all the gains they have made at least since 1991, if not earlier even, on a single roll of the roulette wheel? And it didn't go their way. It hasn't yet so far, at least. Without even making sure their own house was in order. We have a moment, and I'll end with this. We have a moment, and we've had 2 or 3 of them since 2003. For any fellow Iraqis, whether on the stage or in the audience, we're not going to get an infinite number of these opportunities.
Exactly.
We have a moment again now, say in 2018, to rethink the state of Iraq and to build a country, all of us, Arab, Kurd, Sunni, Shi'i, Assyrian, Shabak, Yazidi, Saybi, etc., Turkmen, that all of us have a stake in and all of us have a share in. If we fail to do that, my fear is the last 3 years are going to look like a picnic.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to open it for questions from the audience. Sir, please.
First of all, thank you guys for speaking to us. My question is about the diversification of Iraq's economy. I know you spoke about it a little bit. What are some steps that the Iraqi government has taken so far to diversify, and what are some steps that it should take in the future over the next few years?
I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then we'll ask the panelists to, yes. So the first one is on diversification.
Thank you very much. An outstanding panel and could not be more timely. Alexander Kravitz from Insight. I wonder if you could, maybe this one to Bilal, and to anybody else, but Bilal probably. The upcoming elections November 1st in the KRG. I wonder if you could shed some light about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from the audience? Young lady here. Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you for your panel. My question is with regards to reconciliation with smaller minorities, such as the Yazidis and the Assyrians and other Christian groups who in particular were targeted by ISIS. I'm interested in whether efforts are occurring or what efforts should be occurring. Thank you.
Thank you. Rasha, why don't you take this question? And then we'll go back to the others.
And that's a bit of a complicated question. Again, I can speak only of Mosul and Nineveh's context. Now, in Mosul, in the city, and by Mosul I mean the west side and the east side, we do have some Christian families returning. They're being protected intensely by their neighbors and their friends, and they've reintegrated and retrieved some of the years that they've lost. Now, on the outskirts, however, it's more of a complicated issue. In particular, and this also relates to the referendum, Christian villages were naturally not a part of the KRG. They were kind of taken over during the conflict with ISIS. And we have this simmering kind of tensions that are relatively new. I do recall very clearly in 2009 that the Peshmerga still had a presence in these areas, and there were no tension. In fact, for the Christian population, Assyrian and Chaldean, it was better of an option for them because the security situation in Nineveh in general, and Mosul in particular, was deteriorating. And the first attack directly on Christians happened in 2009. It was a car bomb, an IED that exploded on a school, on a college bus, university bus. Some of my friends were hurt in it on its way back to Al-Qosh. And since then, the Peshmerga presence increased, and they were happy. However, what happened the last time was there was a sense of a loss of identity. They felt that the KRG was going to take over their territory infinitely. And the concept of Assyria and Chaldeans, and they're very patriotic Iraqis as well, they felt that was going to be lost. So where do they stand today? I don't feel we've heard too much from them since the referendum. We saw that there were some different reactions. I think on the long term now with the Iraqi forces in Nineveh, at least what we've heard today, progressing, I think they're going to take a stand that is very pro-Iraq. And once that happens, we can see them returning to their areas. I know in Tel Kef and in Bartella in particular, some of them have been banned from returning to their houses for political reasons during the referendums. In Bartella, it's the PMUs that are not allowing them to come in and kind of rehoming their territory. So they're in a hot spot. In Mosul in particular, no, I think things are getting slightly better. However, we won't see them come back within the next year or so, at least not in large numbers. And understandably so, until there's better security in Iraq. The Yazidis, it's more of a complicated issue. I think they've lost the trust in the country, again, understandably so. This falls into the reconciliation that we were talking about. Reconciliation is often just Sunni, Shia, Kurd, and unfortunately, and I think this is on all of Iraq, we've paid less attention to these minorities until the tragedy of ISIS happened. The Yazidis today, again, are in a weak spot as everyone else. They have to wait for the bigger players to see what they're going to do until they can actually have a claim in anything. I hope that answers your question. Bilal, would you please answer
sure,
the
very
question?
briefly. The November 1st KRG elections, I mean, they're supposed to be held November 1st. The parliament is slated to meet and answer whether they will be held and how. That meeting has been postponed twice so far. And so the best answer is we don't know. Probably the second best answer is that it's not likely. In the post-referendum environment, it was not likely because the referendum created a kind of nationalist unity that would be very difficult within 3 weeks, right, to go from that unity into the kind of polarization that elections require and result. And right now it's also unlikely because the Kurdish society is extremely polarized at this moment, trying to put blame on each other and trying to basically find out, what happened. The dust is still in the air. So elections would probably not be a good idea, and my anticipation is that it will be postponed. There is a possibility that it could be held in some parts of the KRG, but not all over the KRG if the internal disputes go sour. On the question of diversification, this is an important question for Iraq and for the KRG. The oil-dependent economy has proven to everyone that it's not sustainable. So diversification has become a public demand, not just a academic or a specialist demand. The World Bank is helping both the KRG and the Iraqi government now that they're more receptive to advice. Some of the possibilities of diversifying from oil, which has not only economic consequences but security consequences, as we tried to discuss earlier. Iraq is, the Bilad al-Nahrain, the Tigris and the Euphrates. That's where agriculture was founded. So that's obviously a clear opportunity. It's a shame that Iraq still, doesn't have food security and has to rely on food imports, that is. Petrochemicals is the sort of natural industry for both Iraq and the KRG. And not just to sell the oil, but actually have the value added of the petrochemical industry. Reconstruction is definitely an opportunity. It's an opportunity because of all the destruction that has happened. So reconstruction is an opportunity not only for jobs, but also for cooperation between KRG and Baghdad, because some of the major cement factories actually are in KRG. So if there were a major reconstruction effort in Mosul, that would create cooperation opportunities on the question of reconstruction. And then the question of tourism. The KRG, Iraqi Kurdistan, has beautiful landscape. It attracts tourists from all over the country. And of course, the holy sites in the south have promoted religious tourism. So tourism is one of those areas that the Iraqi economy can diversify into. We need probably two main sector reforms for these efforts to actually materialize. One would be the banking sector. The Iraqi economy is very much a cash economy. I think only about 8%, as we learned yesterday from the governor of the Iraqi Central Bank, only 8% of Iraqis have a bank account. So the rest is, cash in a sack. And the other institution that Iraq needs is a sovereign wealth fund, which is what helped some of the Gulf countries deal with low oil prices. The KRG passed a law for a sovereign wealth fund. It has not been implemented yet. Iraq is yet to go that route.
I'm going to take two more questions from the audience. Ren, and then Ren, please.
I'd like to go back to the issue of inclusion. And I agree with Dr. Abbas that ministers and so on are selected from the same political parties, and often it's the same people. But that's normal. Especially in coalition government, in all governments, you choose from the political parties that are represented in parliament and so on. I don't think the problem is really there. In my view, the issue of inclusion refers to the exclusion of a large number, large sectors of Iraqi society and Iraqi political parties from policy making and decision making. So although they are represented in the government and in parliament, but actually policy and decisions are taken by one bloc only. And as a witness of that, when the Kurdish delegation went to Baghdad, shortly before the referendum, I believe, or just after, they went to meet Tahaluf al-Watani, the National Alliance, which is the bloc of Shia parties. They met in a very cursory manner with other groups, but the main dialogue was with the Shia bloc. And that is a good indicator of who actually runs the country. So the issue of inclusion goes beyond just giving people ministerial posts and representation in parliament. It really touches on strategy, policy making, decision making. And that, I think, is worth thinking about, because it seems to me, and I'd like everybody's reaction to this, that with the preeminence of the Hashd al-Shabi, which may increase when we have elections because of their popularity, that unipolar decision-making and policy-making in the country is likely to increase rather than decrease. And therefore, the issue of inclusion will be even more difficult to achieve if we define inclusion as inclusion in real policy, strategy, and decision-making for the country's future.
Thank you. So the question is?
I would like to have their comments about this issue of whether my analysis is correct, that the exclusion refers to exclusion from policy decisions, from deciding on the path of the country and its future. Thank you. And whether the Hashd is going to impact that negatively.
I would like to add to Ren's question, which has to do with the Sunni leadership. I think that's also part of the problem, is that space, the Baghdadis, in a way, the Sunni Baghdadis in government, in parliaments, do not represent the aspiration of the Sunni at large. And so where is the new Sunni leadership going to come from? And so governor level, mayor level, that's very important for us to also talk briefly about. So Abbas, and then we'll go down. Yes, and then.
You're not going to take the other question, right?
We don't have time. We don't have time.
Because you said you are going to take two. Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I agree with you. And I did say that giving an ambassador, not just an ambassadorship, a ministry, any of these top positions to somebody, it's not going to solve the problem. the exclusion in Iraq is not just because there aren't enough cabinet memberships. It's just you count them on two hands on how many you can give. But the exclusion that I'm talking about of the majority of Iraqis from all levels of political and administrative, down to the director of some kind of a government agency, down to the board memberships of airports and small things at the local level and at the national level. Recently there was this big problem about corruption at Najaf Airport, for example. Who are the people who are running Najaf Airport? 4 people selected from the 4 parties. And you take every single one of those. Things that there are a lot of Iraqis who are in and outside Iraq who have training, who have knowledge, who have experience in running those, and they are excluded, and they hire people who have no expertise to the jobs they are hired for. So I'm not talking just about the cabinet, which is, at the highest we had was in the 40s when we really had a hefty cabinet. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of positions that are reserved to 3-4 parties in each one. That is a problem. You need to open those up to people from non-party affiliated population instead of parties running out of people who have expertise and knowledge, and they just begin handing it out to just anybody who's sitting at the door of the party boss. And that is a big problem. But you are right in terms of the exclusion from decision making. That's a problem of the parties that are ruling the country. I mean, it's not you have a structure, and this is a constitutional issue. This is also dictated by the numbers. At the end of the day, if you were to come from Erbil to Baghdad asking for a law to be passed, you will end up being in the parliament, and there is a vote, and the Shia groups, for example, that you refer to are having more saying in the process. They have more votes. This is a structural issue in the government. You cannot do much about it, and I think the way to do it is to either restructure the decision-making or the way Iraq is being administered at the government level, or start demanding having a different arrangement where we will have, ideally, and that's back to the rosy scenarios that my good friend Bilal will probably point out, is to have groups under the ceiling of the parliament who are not made exclusively of one group. The right way to do it is to have parties who draw from all sides of the country, ethnic and religious, just like it used to be happening in the monarchy times. I mean, you had parties from all parties in the monarchy times that ran for politics. They were made of Sunnis, Shia, Kurds, and basically you don't have one group that ends up monopolizing the saying and dictating the fate of. I was one of the people who criticized Mr. Barzani for going out of KRG jurisdiction and deciding the fate of other people, not just his destiny. Certainly, my criticism to my fellow Shia is the same thing. Do not decide the fate of everyone else according to your own liking. So this is a structural issue. It has to be handled that way, rather than just going as they were doing. Basically, now what is happening is outside the Constitution, what was you were referring to. A group from Erbil goes to talks to a group out of the parliament, out of the government, to a group of politicians because they know they have this sway in the parliament. And then we end up doing politics on the side, not where they belong, in the real negotiation by the representatives of the people.
Russia. Sorry, Ambassador Ron, for your questions. Those are great. I'm going to answer this question and the one about the Sunni politicians. I completely agree with your analysis on the situation. Let's approach the Sunnis and see what exactly do the population want. That's the question. It's very different today than what they wanted in 2003. So they started sort of rejectionist, refusing the concept of the new Iraq in 2003, persisting that they were at least half of the population, if not the majority, rejecting anything different. That's not the same situation today in 2017, when their most aspiration is just to return to their homes. We're talking about 2 to 3 million internally displaced people. We talk about elections and democracy. How will these people vote? Where will they vote? On what jurisdictions will they vote? Are they part of Mosul? Are they part of different parts of the outskirts of the city? Where are the voting polls? How will they be placed? Who's going to monitor? That's a huge concern. People are saying, we don't want to boycott the elections anymore. We did that in 2005 and we paid heavily for it. But how can we vote now? We live in Erbil. How do we vote? That's an issue that kind of falls into this whole political plan for 2018. I don't see that being discussed anywhere. That's an important thing. As for a certain political bloc kind of dominating, again, like you said, that is normal. But this is not at the micro level. This is kind of the point where I focus, unlike my panelists who are by far more experienced at the macro level than I am. This is what the people actually see. If you talk to any average Iraqi, Sunni priest, they will tell you Dawah party controls it. And I know that's the party that we should not mention, but that's the reality of it. So the process, the structure, how decisions are being made at parliament level and how the prime minister later on approves or not, I think that has failed in Iraq. That hasn't worked properly. The parliament itself is so polarized that certain decision will pass regardless of who else disagrees with them. So the structure, again, I think has to be reviewed, and I agree with your point on this. Again, to the new faces or the fresh faces in Sunni politicians, we won't be seeing them this elections, and we won't be seeing them perhaps even in the next upcoming elections. And I'm going to draw on the points that my panelists mentioned about the patronage strategy. If you want to find the perfect example of corrupted patronage in politics, you look at the Sunni politicians. Like Bilal was saying, the way they have dominated the scene makes it very, very hard for new faces and newcomers to actually even join the political process. I think there is more awareness now, of course, than 2005, whereas especially this younger generation from 25 to mid-late 40s, they're very interested now in becoming more politically active. They're facing, however, kind of a counter from the well-known established politicians. Right now, the people are going to vote, in my opinion, most likely to the current leadership, not current well-known figures. I think it's kind of end game for the new JPs. I don't see them coming back very strong. However, for the current governor in Ninawa, for the current governor in Anbar, I think they will get most of the votes kind of as just the de facto reality of the situation, that there's no one else better to vote for. Whether or not in the next 4 to 8 years we will see new faces, I think we will. It's just a matter of supporting them. And also their tendencies. Are they going to fall into what I call the good Sunni category that are approved by the PMUs? They have elected certain Sunni names that they seem to be happy with, though they're not very popular. Or will we find new bold voices that are more aware of the situation, more realistic in their aspirations as Sunnis? I think this is going to be the mainstream view in the next couple of years, as long as the Madaniya kind of prevails in Baghdad as well. We might see that. In this upcoming elections, no, we're going to see the same faces.
Thank you very much. We can continue on and on. This is really a terrific panel. But we have another terrific panel coming up, and we need to take a break of about 10 minutes, reconvene at 2:45. Thank you again. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you.
Thanks. So I confess my origins with Iraq were at the U.S. Institute of Peace many years ago. It's really a great pleasure to be able to moderate this panel on Iraq's regional opportunities, perspectives for Iraq and its neighbors. One of the things that I teach rather assiduously in my conflict management courses is that geography may not be your only destiny, but it's certainly part of your destiny. And certainly that applies in the case of Iraq. And what I propose to do is to take both an inside-out look, that is, from Baghdad to the region, and then a look from the region into Iraq, to think about whether the goals of Iraq and its neighbors are in some way consistent, and if so, how can they be helpful to each other in stabilizing a part of the world which has really been through hell, if I can put it bluntly. This is not what most of us predicted or would have liked to see when the Americans invaded in 2003. And many people in the room actually worked very hard to avoid anything like the current situation.
Some worked on it.
And failed, and failed. Let me do some brief introductions of our speakers. Mohammed Yahya is an expert on Middle East security. He's a Saudi, looks at these questions from a Gulf perspective and a GCC perspective. Liesl Hintz is an assistant professor of international relations here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I have to admit I've met her for the first time this afternoon.
There's a lot of us.
She has a particular interest in identity and foreign policy, that is, in how internal politics and foreign policy affect each other. And she has a particular expertise in Turkey, which is one of Iraq's very important neighbors. Sayed Hussein Mousavian has many claims to fame, not the least of which is that he's a professor at Princeton, where I got my PhD, so we have a certain school tie affinity. He spent many years inside the Iranian government and inside its national security apparatus. He's now at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, which, if you haven't been there, it's got to be a great pleasure to be a professor there. He will be interested in part in that other big question in Washington right now, the nuclear question. And I'll press him a little to comment on how what's happening in that arena is affecting how Iran sees Iraq and vice versa. And then last, but by far not least, the Honorable Ambassador Fareed Yassin, who has many distinctions. He joined the Foreign Ministry in 2004. He has been Director of Policy Planning a couple of times. And since November of 2016, he's been Iraq's ambassador in Washington. And I must say, from my earliest moments, remembering our meetings, always somebody who understood a hell of a lot about what was going on inside Iraq and between Iraq and its neighbors. So I think, Mr. Ambassador, we should start with you to give Baghdad's view of its neighborhood and maybe a little beyond its neighborhood, because nobody can ignore the big neighbor in the room, which happens to be Washington, and maybe we wouldn't want to ignore the other neighbors in the room, like Russia and other important world players. So, Mr. Ambassador, can you give us, I'm afraid this time it really does apply, but I have to ask you not to take too much time doing it, a tour d'horizon.
Okay, well, it's a good thing I speak French. You know, I recognized what you said about the importance of geography. Geography is something you don't choose, but like family. And somebody else has said it differently. It's location, location, location. So we got a good location. It gives us a lot of oil and resources. We've got water. We've got history, a hell of a lot of history. And history is important because it tells you how you deal with geography, and sometimes how geography deals with you. And that's an important message, because one of the critical issues that our region will have to deal with, and this often gets forgotten, and that is my main point of contention with your administration, is climate change. That being said, Iraq is about 100 years old, a little less. And it's in a really interesting neighborhood. And let's do a tour d'horizon of our neighbors. So they span many cultures, many languages, many faiths, well, actually mostly Muslim, but different interpretations, some more intense than others. And it is also a country that is at the crossroads of many zones of influence. So Iraq has been called, and I hate that appellation, you know, the portal of the eastern portal of the Arab world, which implies wars. That was something that was very popular with the former regime. But it is in a sense true in that to our east we have, you know, Persian Empire. To the north we have the Turks. To the east, to the west, we have Arab countries that are, in fact, an extension of our population. And to the south, we have the font of Arab and Islamic culture, which is Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, you know, the ever-present Kuwait. This is important. Iraq being at these crossroads, being the locus of many migrations, we find ourselves to be at the center of structures that extend beyond our borders. So we have tribes that span, you know, the north-south axis from Saudi Arabia all the way to Syria. We have the same thing with the Kurdish tribes who span the border with Turkey and with Iran. I myself have actually cousins in Kuwait. In fact, two of them are ambassadors of Kuwait. That's something I'm really proud of. So in a sense, Iraq is enmeshed with its neighboring countries, culturally, ethnically, you know, demographically, and that dictates on us what our policy should be. And I paraphrase this by saying, in a sense, that Iraq is somewhat in a similar situation to Switzerland. And people, when I say this, people start to, you know, look Google-eyed at me. Why is he saying this? Well, if you look at Switzerland, it shares some of these same characteristics that Iraq has. It has multiple languages. It's both Catholic, Protestant, with some cantons that are mixed. You know, it has cultural affinities. Some of parts of its population has cultural affinities with some of its neighbors. And what is known about it is that it is a neutral country. And the question is, why is it neutral? Well, because most of the wars of the 17th and 18th centuries were either sectarian or national in nature. And had Switzerland taken sides with any of these wars, it would have torn it apart. We're in a similar situation. So the only policy that is consistent with the way Iraq is one of a strong, proactive neutrality. Emphasize every single word of those. Strong, proactive neutrality. Strong because it's a tough neighborhood. You know, we need, and in fact, the Swiss Army is one of the best trained in the area. And after, you know, this interlude with ISIS, I think we have the best, you know, special forces in the region. So thank you, ISIS. But no, thank you. And our history has told us how we have interacted, how we should interact with this. Iraq's first international pact, as soon as it became independent, was the Sadabat Pact, which not a lot of people talk about, but it was a non-aggression pact between Turkey, the former occupying power, Iran, and Afghanistan. Pakistan didn't exist at the time. And then there was a later incarnation of this, which was the Baghdad Pact, which included a few other countries. This time Pakistan was there, and of course, you know, the great Western powers, but that was put a stop to by the great rivalry between East and West that we fell prey to thanks to the coup that took place in 1958. So when you go to the website of the Iraqi Foreign Ministry, you will read that we will not be part of any axes in the region. And that's another way of formulating that we will not side in a war from any with any. We want to have a proactive neutrality that respects others' internal affairs, but that wants to exchange as much as possible with them. And one of the things that we have suffered over the last 10 years, I would say, people say that some countries have meddled more than others in our country. In fact, it's not that. It's that many countries were not present in Iraq. And I'm specifically talking about our Arab neighbors. They could have done a lot to help us. I think their absence was a mistake. I think that absence is recognized as a mistake by their decision makers now. There has been a readjustment. That's one of the major developments of the last few months, that now all countries, all neighboring countries of Iraq are involved, from Saudi Arabia to Iran to Turkey and to Jordan, where we're working on increasing our levels of interactions with them. For example, with regard to Saudi Arabia, we've elevated our level of interaction from a joint commission to a coordinating council with trade missions, with exchanges. Of course, this doesn't mean that we're going to curtail or cut down on any of our exchanges with any of our other neighbors. They're going apace. We're trying to build new projects, for example, with Jordan that will, I think, not be of benefit not only to us in Iraq and Jordan, but to the whole region, as a matter of fact. And so, like I said, a proactive neutrality, friends with all, enemies to none, unless those that want to be our enemies. In this case, we won't let them. But I think this is where we are. Let me just say one more thing. We're in a hard position right now. We've had to confront a crisis that very few countries have had to deal with. I've seen people address Iraq as if it were a fragile state. I really beg to differ. I think it's an exemplar of resilience. And we have, weathered the big storms, including this referendum business. I think, wiser minds will prevail and things will simmer down for the benefit of all Iraqis. And I say all Iraqis purposefully. But the damage that has been left by ISIS to the infrastructure of Iraq, to the land of Iraq, to the people of Iraq, needs to be repaired. And we can't do that on our own. And there again, that will give us another opportunity to interact even further with our neighbors. And I'm glad to say that Kuwait has decided, and we're grateful for that, to host an international donor conference in January of this coming year to help us repair, rebuild, and restart. Certainly the parts of Iraq that were occupied by ISIS, there'll be a focus on that. But we should not forget the other parts of Iraq that also had to suffer the neglect that ensued from having all the resources of the country devoted to the war against ISIS, which we will be about to finish, I hope, soon enough, victoriously.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I think I'm going to press you a little bit in the future on Turkey and Iran in particular, but let's look a little bit from the outside, and we'll have another opportunity to do that. Liesl, Turkey?
Turkey, yes.
How does it view, what does it want to see in Iraq? How does it go about trying to achieve that?
So Turkey's had a really sort of interesting developing relationship with the Turkish central government, but with the Iraqi central government in Baghdad, but also specifically with the KRG. And a lot of that has to do with the changing nature of identity politics in Turkey and changing institutional structures in Turkey. Previous governments in Turkey that were either run or influenced by the secular military were very opposed to any kind of political recognition of the Kurds, particularly because Turkey also has a very large Kurdish minority that is divided in its goals, some of whom want just cultural rights, some of whom want independence, some of whom want regional autonomy, some of whom just want not to be oppressed forever. So, you know, the Turkey's had sort of a two-pronged approach to Iraq in the sense that it deals with Baghdad and it deals with the KRG in two very different political paths. In the previous, you know, in the past couple of years, particularly under Abadi, there were a lot of sectarian tensions between the Sunni Justice and Development Party, the ruling AKP in Turkey, which pursues what I call an Ottoman Islamist understanding of Turkish national identity that sort of both defines what it means to be a Turk, but also defines how Turkey's policy should approach the region. And that is as former home of the Caliphate and the Sultanate and the head of Sunni Islam, a power that, you know, by its historical legitimacy should be able to strongly influence the affairs of its neighbors. And part of this we see in the now quite defunct you know, zero problems with neighbors strategy, which, you know, and now everybody, it's almost de rigueur that you have to say now Turkey has zero neighbors with zero problems. But, you know, it's interesting, if Iraq is the Switzerland, Turkey is quite the opposite in the sense that, you know,
Kingdom.
Pardon?
It's the Middle Kingdom.
There's so many metaphors for it, but, you know, yes, Turkey pursued what some historians have called an active neutrality during World War II, kind of trying to play both sides without necessarily getting involved in conflicts. But under the AKP, the foreign policy orientation, undergirded by a doctrine of strategic depth, which was the sort of brainchild of former foreign minister, prime minister, and now kind of shuffled out of power, Ahmet Davutoglu. You know, who was an intellectual who saw Turkey as having, you know, really missed out on opportunities to forge relationships with its neighbors. It saw previous secular Western-oriented governments as having looked at Muslim populations as backward, having not wanting to be seen as having any kind of Middle Eastern ties whatsoever, and so therefore missed out on economic, security, and identity relations that it could have forged with these countries, and Iraq was one of them. And so, you know, under this strategic depth policy, there were many, many outreaches. Again, both with Baghdad, but also both with the KRG. And Erdogan was the first Turkish head of state to visit Erbil, for example, on an official visit. Turkey opened a consulate in Erbil in 2010. So it's, you know, it's really from a Sunni Shia perspective, from a Turkish Kurdish perspective, from a perspective of a country that views itself, rightly or wrongly, as a legitimate regional power whose interests should be taken into consideration. You know, Turkey really saw Iraq as a way to try to cooperate in terms of its problems with the PKK, for example, being allowed to pursue PKK forces across the border into Iraq. It has very, up until the referendum, although I disagree the extent to which, and we'll probably talk about the referendum a little bit later, but I disagree about arguments saying that Erdogan, the former prime minister, now president of Turkey, is really upset with Erbil for holding the referendum. I think he has to say that. I think that, you know, he's worried about his own Kurds doing the same thing. But at the same time, he is more than excited about the prospect of a Sunni ally in the region and the economic development that comes from the oil flows that are coming from the KRG. So it's been, again, this kind of two-pronged approach to Iraq, dealing with them separately. And of course, Turkey's outreaches to the KRG have scuppered relationships with Baghdad, particularly under Abadi, where there was this really heightened sectarian rhetoric that was being tossed back and forth. But I think, you know, Turkey, with its outreaches or its sort of it's sending forces to Idlib in Syria, really wants to play a very strong regional role and sees Iraq and the KRG as potential players and partners in that.
Thank you. Mohammed.
Yep.
Saudi Arabia is one of these places which stood aloof a little for a while. But how is the kingdom seeing Iraq today?
Yeah. I think for more than a while. Over the past year, we've seen diplomatic relations restored. We've seen the border crossing between Iraq and Saudi Arabia opened. There's now a Saudi consulate in Erbil. So relations between Saudi Arabia and Iraq have improved, almost beyond recognition over the past several months. What happened was after the 2003 invasion, the U.S. invasion, the Saudis refused to engage Iraq, and the logic behind that was that something you'll hear quite often is that Prince Saud Al Faisal, our late foreign minister, told the Bush administration, you don't go and solve one problem in Iraq because you're going to get 5 others. The Saudi government had its fair share of problems with Saddam. There was deep enmity, but they were against the idea of the invasion. The Bush administration asked Saudi Arabia to, look after their interests, come into Iraq, be involved in the political process in Iraq in a post-invasion setting. But the response was, this is a U.S. problem, and the U.S. has to fix it on its own. However, soon after the invasion happened, and then what you'll hear from Saudi officials, is that Nouri al-Maliki came into power, and his sectarian politics, his leaning towards Iran, would have made engagement impossible. I don't know if that holds true. I don't know if no engagement was a sound policy at any point. But today, it's very clear that there's political will to reverse that on many different levels, as the ambassador mentioned. And I think the interest that the Saudis have, there's an understanding today that you're not going to get a perfect solution. You're not going to, eliminate ties between Iran and Iraq. You're not going to be able to change geography. But what you will be able to do is help Iraq reach a stage that's agreeable, at least nominally, to all of its Arab neighbors. An independent Iraq, as the ambassador mentioned, a strong, proactive Iraq that has a government representative of its own people, and a government that is after development and prosperity in Iraq, and a unified Iraq. And that's the idea. It's good representative governance.
Thank you very much. Professor Mousavian. It's a difficult moment in U.S.-Iran relations, and it has implications for Iran-Iraq as well.
Thank you. I would say the first and the most important Iranian policy objective in Iraq, in relation with Iraq, is to have a friendly relation with Iraq, because even relations between Iran and Iraq before revolution was problematic. And right after revolution, Saddam invaded Iran, and the two countries, they were engaged in 8 years war. Therefore, that would be extremely important for Iran, a peaceful, friendly coexistence and good relationship with such a neighbor, such an important neighbor like Iraq. The second important would be security and stability in Iraq, because Iranians, they really feel the security and stability of Iraq is part of security and stability of Iran, because Iran and Iraq, they have 1,500 kilometers of common borders. And every insecurity or instability in Iraq would immediately have a huge impact on the security and stability situation in Iraq. The third is about integrity of Iraq. Iranians are very worried, sensitive about possibility of any disintegration. Everybody now is talking about possible independence of Kurdistan, but there has been some maps distributed about independent country Sunni, independent country Shia, independent country Kurdistan. Therefore, keeping the integrity of Iraq, I believe, would be the third policy objective of Iran. The fourth is eradicating terrorism, because the presence of terrorism in Iraq would be the biggest national security threat to security of Iran. That's why Iranians, they have invested so much blood and treasure to fight terrorism in Iraq, to cooperate with the Iraqi army to eradicate the terrorism. Number five, the disputes, the most important dispute before revolution was a treaty about the borders between Iran and Iraq, 1975 treaty, which ultimately they agreed in 1975 in Algeria between Shah and Saddam. But right after revolution, Saddam torn the treaty and invaded Iran. Therefore, strengthening this treaty would be a part of stability and security and good relation between Iran and Iraq. Number six, I would say Iranians, they have been always worried about US military presence in a neighboring country. Everywhere, it is not about Iraq. They are worried about Persian Gulf, in Arabian countries, everywhere. I mean, even they are worried about presence of NATO in Turkey, presence of the US in Afghanistan. This is not only about Iraq. But when the US invaded Iraq, I believe one of the main sources of instability in the region and Iraq, whether this is going to continue or hopefully after Iraq is totally stable, then the US military forces would withdraw from Iraq or not. This is a matter of concern for the Iranians. Number seven is, since Iranians and Iraqis, they have centuries of cultural, religious, ethnic, and even family relations. I mean, we have tens of thousands of Iraqis, they have married with Iranians, or hundreds of thousands, I don't know the number, but the number is really big. Iranians, they have married Iraqis. You have six holiest religious sites of Shia in Iraq. We have Marja'iyya, Najaf, always have been important for Iranians. Therefore, a very extensive, close cultural, social, peoples-to-peoples relation between Iran and Iraq is also important. Last but not least is long-term strategy of Iran, how Iranians, they view to be engaged in a sustainable cooperation with Iraq, while they can have the same sustainable good relation with the other GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, because at the end, as long as we don't have a good relation between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, we are not going to have sustainable peace, security, stability in Persian Gulf, because they are the three big powers. And the Iranian theory, strategy, initiative is to have a regional cooperation system using the ideas of Westphalia, OSCE, EU, many other regional cooperation systems we have worldwide, between GCC, which would engulf Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, to bring the rivalries, competitions, in engagement and cooperation as a regional system maintaining peace, security, and stability in the region. We have much more, but I think 8 is enough then.
But let me ask you, how does the current disturbance in relations between Washington and Tehran, how does that affect the situation in Iraq?
Definitely, it doesn't have a good impact. It has negative impact. But since the US invaded Iraq, I think Iranians and Americans and Iraqis, they have a type of understanding that Iran-US hostilities should not hurt Iraqi stability and security and interest. That's why I have never seen any Iranian officials to oppose Iraqis to have normal relation with the US. And I remember when I was in national security in 2003, after Saddam invaded, the US invaded Iraq, Hakim came to Iran to have a consultation whether Iranians would be angry if he goes to Washington to negotiate with Americans to have normal relation. Everybody said, this is your choice. We have no problem if you're going to have good relations. even they really are looking for a normal relation between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, because I think Iraq is in well positioned even to mediate between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and the US to decrease the tensions.
So what I'm hearing from pretty much everybody is that there aren't a lot of incompatible interests here. There's possibility for not only coexistence, but a good deal of cooperation. And in particular, the question arises, how can cooperation be encouraged in this post-ISIS period? Iraq is going to be going through this difficult, extraordinarily expensive reconstruction process. So the question is, what can the neighbors do, Mr. Ambassador, to help Iraq come out of it in the right direction?
Be generous.
Be generous? You need money?
Well, no, we don't only need money. We need expertise. I always make this analogy. I mean, look at the United States. In 1941, it was attacked. Ensued a very rapid phase of militarization, victory in 4 years later. And then something happened. The United States took its military class and transformed it into the most productive engine of economic growth through mechanisms like the GI Bill. So, you know, fast forward to Iraq in 2014, we are into a war. 4 years later, 2018, hopefully next year, ISIS is going to be a bad memory, okay? We've had a very strong militarization. In fact, everybody would agree that Iraq is over-militarized now. And here, the example of the United States would be very telling to us. How do we generate our own GI Bill to transform these young men who have really given their all to save the country, to help them, you know, build families, build careers, rebuild the country, add to the region, in fact. And there are other examples I can go into where we could look to the United States for help. For example, again, right after the Second World War, you had this wonderful Levittown program. You have all these thousands of young men coming back from the war. They want to get married, raise kids. They need housing. Levittown programs enabled them to have cheap, affordable, decent housing. And housing is an engine, a non-oil sector engine of the economy. It is also these kinds of things that we need to look to. And it's not for nothing that we'll look forward to the Saudi experience, because they have companies that are very well versed, you know, in civil engineering and housing and construction and all sorts of other things.
Well, Mohammed, I was going to turn to you next. There's a need for money. There's a need for technical capacity. Both Saudi Arabia and Turkey, I would say, and I'll turn to Liesl next, have real potential in this direction. Are you ready to play?
I think Saudi Arabia and the rest of the GCC countries would be more than willing to both invest and contribute to the rebuilding of post-ISIS areas in Iraq. One of the main concerns, though, is to eliminate the conditions that have to do with governance, that have to do with the way the military was being run, that allowed groups like ISIS to flourish. The sectarianism, the lack of representation for Sunnis in government and in the military. So these are things that need to be addressed. But the other part has to do with the importance of having a strong central government in Iraq and having a strong unified Iraq that's able to control its borders. You know, Iraq also is important because of its place in the region. Hezbollah restocking logistically. Armaments that go to Assad, unfortunately, are going through Iraq. At different points, that might have happened because the government turned a blind eye. That might have happened because of weak control over certain areas in Iraq. But a strong, cohesive Iraqi government with strong control of its borders is just the first step in a larger plan for the region in order to cut logistical and financial support for groups that everybody in the international community views as problematic.
If I understand you correctly, yes, Saudi Arabia will be ready to play, but would like to see some conditions.
Of course, and it's not black and white.
Iraq.
I mean, it will help where it can in certain areas, but there's not going to be a carte blanche either way.
Lisa, I'll turn to you, but I'll warn Professor Mousavian that I'll turn to him next as well, because especially on this question of what happens with the demobilized soldiers, that's an important question also for the Iranian side of the equation. Lisa?
So is the AKP in Turkey, is Erdogan ready to play in Iraq? Absolutely. Is the Turkish economy ready to play in Iraq? Not necessarily. And what's really interesting about this is that the Turkish economy has been growing and growing, and it depends on how you measure the statistics, and they've actually changed the way in which they measure them, which has made the growth look more favorable in the past few years. But Turkey's economy, partially because Turkey underwent such an immense financial and monetary crisis in 2001, they undertook a lot of banking reforms and so forth, and so it was a much more resilient economy come 2008. And so Turkey continues to grow by a decent percentage while its European neighbors, who, by the way, keep telling Turkey, you don't belong, you're not good enough for us, are really suffering. And very nationalist Turks took quite a lot of pleasure in seeing Greece not doing so well, frankly. But in terms of the economic growth that we're seeing, so much of it is undergirded by corruption, by sweetheart deals, by handing out political patronage, by infusions of hot money that are not necessarily stable. When you look at what's happening with the Turkish currency, when you look at how foreign direct investment is pulling out, I mean, it's really, we've been thinking, observers have been thinking it's on the brink of crisis for years. We're stunned that it hasn't happened yet. Right now, you have the former Turkish economic minister being indicted by the US government. You have Reza Zarrab, who was the Iranian-Turkish oil for gold merchant who was trying to avoid sanctions on Iran and make Turkey rich at the same time. He's perhaps going to testify very soon. We don't know if he'll testify, but so you have an economy that is really built on quite a lot of corruption. And actually, the way in which that's tied to the construction industry is quite interesting, because Turkey would love to expand its construction industry in the KRG in Iraq, as it has throughout MENA, throughout the MENA region. But when you actually look at, for example, Transparency International, which is an NGO that measures corruption levels, they look at the percentage of the economy that is based on construction as a way in which to gauge whether or not a country is corrupt, because there's so many hidden ways in which you can funnel money through the construction industry. How successful of a potential economic investor can Turkey be is one element. The other aspect to that is how reliable of a potential ally or regional negotiator can Turkey be. We've seen Turkey clearly try to play this role, and it doesn't necessarily recognize that Iran, Saudi, and Iraq are the biggest powers in the region. It would like to think it is, or has the most weight that it can throw around. But in terms of the ways in which we've seen what's happened between the US and Turkey over the past 2 weeks, we have Turkey continually arresting US individuals and consular officials. We had the US on Sunday recognizing this, placing or suspending visas. So I don't know if I can do research in the future, because Turkey then came back and said, okay, we're not going to give out any non-immigrant visas to Americans. So they're preventing travel. This is a step to try to rein Turkey in, but it's not necessarily an effective one, because I think it hurts the wrong people. But if you also see the way in which Turkey has really pulled back from the EU, and not just pulled back politically, because it has a significant right to, because the EU hasn't necessarily applied the same standards to Turkey as it did to Croatia, for example, who was able to join the EU extremely quickly. But the way in which it's not only pulled away politically and stopped the reform process, but also started this war of words with Germany and with the Netherlands, and calling them fascists and Nazis, and this idea that they're going to buy an S-400 missile defense system from Russia that's not compatible with NATO technology. All to the point of saying that Turkey is not necessarily the most reliable ally under this particular government. So I don't know if the economy can handle it in terms of investment in Iraq, and I don't know how much I would want Turkey at the negotiating table for me in the region.
Thank you. Professor Mousavian, if I understand correctly, Iran has already played quite a strong role in reconstruction in large part of southern Iraq. And of course, it has a role in Kurdistan as well. How do you envisage, after this defeat of ISIS, the Iranian economic role, but also the Iranian role in this question of demobilization? Because the Hashd al-Shabi, at least some of them, are in some sense related to Iran, get support from Iran, get help from Iran. So is Iran ready to see them demobilized or put into GI Bill type education programs? Pardon?
I got to say something about this.
Okay. Please.
Ambassador first.
Ambassador.
Well, the popular mobilization, there's a lot that's been said about it. These are essentially people who rose in response to the call of the Marja'iyya in June of 2014 to fill up the space left by the departing army. Many of them were people older than me, and many were younger than the youngest amongst you, and many died. And now, I've seen their faces. I went to Baghdad in August and September 2014. You could see them plastered on the walls. So now the Prime Minister took a brave measure, a smart measure, an intelligent measure, to incorporate them within the armed forces of the Iraqi state. They are official. They are Iraqi. They're not Iranian. We may get some support from Iran just as we get support from the United States. Okay? But again, this is an important question. We have to demobilize. It's an economic necessity. It's a human necessity, I think, once this war is going to be over. And in fact, one single example I'll mention. So just now we completed discussions with the World Bank. One of the most interesting, I think, and useful meetings we had was with the country manager in Colombia, who told us about the Colombian government's program for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. It's something, that caught us by the throat. This is something that we really need. That's something, everybody with the right mind would say, this is something you have to incorporate in Iraq. And like I'm actually, as soon as we left the meeting, I told one of my staffers to get me an appointment with the Colombian ambassador. But these are Iraqi forces.
Professor.
Then I understand there is sensitivities in countries like United States, Saudi Arabia, Emirate, even Israelis about Iranian presence or cooperation with Iraqi government or Hezbollah presence in Iraq or support Iraqi government fighting ISIS. But even there is sensitivity in Tehran about the US military presence over there. But everyone, I believe, should respect the fact Iraq is an independent country, sovereign government, and they should decide for fighting ISIS who can help, which country should play what role. They have invited Iranians to support them to fight ISIS. And Iranians are there only because of the invitation of Iraqi government. Exactly like the US is there because of the invitation of Iraqi government. It is not business of Iranian government whether Iraqis, Americans are there, or business of Saudis or Americans if Iranians are there. This is Iraqi government as a sovereign, independent country and government. They decide what to do. This is number one. Number two, undermining the minorities, Sunni minorities, is a really important issue. I fully understand what Muhammad is saying. I believe government in Baghdad should be very careful not to give such an impression to Sunni minorities in Iraq. Even if they are 15%, they should have 20% role, to give more role to them. And to satisfy the GCC countries that the minority Sunnis, they would be totally respected and immune, and they would have a huge role. Number three is the fact on the ground. The US was leading international coalition 2014, and ISIS was occupying cities, lands of Iraqis, Syrians, one city after one city. Mosul, Kirkuk, and the US military, the US coalition was really helpless. What they could do. Today, 86% of what ISIS gained 2014 in Syria and in Iraq is retaken. They have lost 86%. It is because of what? Iranians and Hezbollah, they have played a very critical, plus Hashd al-Sha'bi. They have played a really important role fighting ISIS. It was the Prime Minister of Iraq, Haider al-Abadi, who said, without Iranian support, Baghdad may have collapsed. It was Barzani, the president of Kurdistan region, who said, without Iranian support, Erbil would have collapsed. Therefore, such a support, such a presence, fighting ISIS should be welcomed. If our friends Saudis, they do not like it, are they in position to give guarantee to Iraqi government today that if Iran leaves, Hezbollah leaves, Hashd al-Sha'bi leaves, Saudi is in position to put boots on the ground to fight ISIS? None of the Arab countries, they would be able to do it. Therefore, this is something really, I really don't understand. Of course, if ISIS is totally eradicated, then whether the Iraqi government would decide to demobilize or integrate to full integration of Hashd al-Sha'bis, this is their business. This is Parliament of Iraq, government of Iraq, they have to decide. But I don't really see any Iranians would be willing to be one day military Iranian forces or advisors, to be one day in Iraq if ISIS or terrorism threat is removed. Why they should be there? I mean, other than blood and treasure, what is the gain for Iranians? Only to keep their borders safe from ISIS entering Iran and helping the sovereignty, integrity, stability, and security of Iraq.
Yeah. You know, with respect to Professor Mousavian, certain elements of the Hashd and Hezbollah and a large number of other Iranian-backed organizations are the reason groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda thrive. I mean, they're no less barbaric than ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I mean, we've all seen the videos of Abu Azrail, a member of the Hashd in Iraq, albeit not part of the official government-sanctioned Hashd, cutting up an alleged Sunni jihadist. I'm sorry for putting this image in your head, like a kebab over a bonfire. We've seen videos of young boys being shot to death by these rogue elements. These rogue elements are backed by Iran. Hezbollah has killed thousands of Americans. Hezbollah has an industry of taking Western hostages for ransom in order to raise funds. Hezbollah is one of the largest actors in the drug trade internationally. These are terrorist organizations that are as much a problem as ISIS. To sit down and posit that these organizations are used to fight a group like ISIS is utterly ridiculous, in my opinion. I mean, the view in the Gulf and the view in many Western policy circles is that these two organizations, these Sunni extremist groups and these Shia extremist groups, are equally barbaric, equally criminal, and should be removed from public life and removed from the streets in countries like Iraq if these countries were ever to develop. And unfortunately, you know, any country where you see Iranian intervention very prevalent. Look at Iran, Lebanon right now. Lebanon is a crippled country. In 2003 and 2004, Lebanon used to be a tourist destination for people the world over. I was there in 2003 and 2004. You couldn't find a hotel room in that country. Today, it's a ghost town. I was there in August. I mean, Hezbollah is stronger than it's ever been. It constantly threatens the Lebanese government to take over Beirut if they do anything wrong. It's the strongest military power over there. And the reason is it receives armaments, logistical support, and cash from Iran via Iraq and then via Syria. I mean, the past 8 years in the city and elsewhere have distracted from the true role that Iran plays in the Levant, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and it's a truly destructive role that has to be pushed back, eliminated in order to see a sustained development in these areas. And I think we should be calling a spade a spade. Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these are all organizations that should be fought.
Mohammed, this is my point.
Yeah.
We should leave it to Iraqi government.
Mhm.
It is not the business of Iran or Saudi Arabia or the US.
Of course, and the Iraqi government has
Iraqi government,
made great.
if they want Hezbollah, Iran, Hashd al-Shabi, we should respect
One of the
it.
positive points is that the
This
Iraqi
is number
government
one.
has made a lot of headway in cutting back on Iranian influence on these rogue elements of the Hashd that
you
are
should
cutting
understand-
people up.
But you should understand,
just like
Iraq-
ISIS does. I mean,
you should understand Iraqi.
they understand
government-
what the issue is.
Iraqi
And-
government they have totally different opinion, like what you have.
Let's
This
turn
is
to the
what-
Iraqi government for a moment.
Yeah, I was gonna-
and
But
see what it thinks.
Dan,
I think there's no
Dan,
disagreement
about
that
Hezbollah.
that an
About
organized
Hezbollah.
Hashd that is
Hezbollah is part of Iraqi, Lebanese political establishment. They are official party. They have representative in parliament. They have representative in Lebanon government. And if you ask Prime Minister of Lebanon or President of Lebanon, are you ready to forgive the military power to forgo the military power of Hezbollah today? They would tell you no. Because without Hezbollah, they would have not been able to kick the Israelis out of Lebanon. Without Hezbollah, ISIS would have occupied part of Lebanon today. You don't like Hezbollah? Of course. Iranians also, they don't like your support for ISIS, Saudi Arabia's support for ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda. There are thousands of reports in US media, hundreds of official statements by US presidents, ministers, Europeans. They say, where is the source of ideology, money, weapon for these terrorist groups, whether this is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Boko Haram, all of them, they are coming from one source. And you can read thousands of articles. Even President Trump, who is today a very good strategic partner of Saudi Arabia, before election, you remember, Muhammad, he said Saudi Arabia is source number one of supporting terrorism. Well, now is strategic partner of Saudi Arabia, no problem. But the fact is, on the regional issues, my point is here, we should respect the view of Lebanon government. Lebanon has a sovereign government. They want Hezbollah. If Hezbollah is not there, anytime, any day, Israelis, they can invade, they can occupy Lebanon.
I think it's better not to
Let me-
obfuscate
let
and
me-
stick
This
to
is why
facts.
Turkey can't get a word in edgewise in the region, by the way.
Let me stop both of you there and just say that we've registered a very clear disagreement about who supports whom and who's a terrorist and who isn't a terrorist. So
Someone should ask Rafiq
I-
al-Hariri.
I think there's very clear difference of view. But Mr. Ambassador Fareed, I'd like to turn to you and say, you know.
Can I say just one sentence?
Yes, I do. I want to.
Okay, now one sentence.
I want to give you.
No, one sentence, and I'll say it, and it's
Absolutely.
very brief. Nothing is worse than ISIS, period.
Nothing is worse than ISIS, period. But the question.
Except maybe son of ISIS, but
The question I
let's
have for
prevent
you.
them from coming.
The question I have for you is, when you talk about demobilization, demilitarization, you're talking about not only the Iraqi army, but also
No,
the
clearly.
Hashd al-Shabi.
No, clearly.
And
I mean, we have a lot of people under uniform. We'd like to, just as the United States did after the Second World War, it's the GIs they sent to college. This is what we want to do.
But what will you do with those who are still irregular?
We want to regularize those who are, whatever you want to call them. But there is a guiding principle of the Iraqi government that it's working hard to implement, which is the Iraqi government must have monopoly of force, period, as in any government that respects itself.
Well, I think that's an area where all could agree.
Okay.
Yes, of
Let
course.
me do this. We're about half an hour from having to conclude, so I was going to open the floor to questions. I particularly invite questions about Turkey, only because Liesl has been left out a little bit here.
That's how Turkey feels.
And I don't
I
want
can talk about I can talk about how Turkey also sponsors terrorism. I can talk about how Turkey allows ISIS fighters to travel through its borders. I can talk about how Turkey started agreeing to participate in the fight against ISIS on the day that it began bombing the PKK, so that the international community was not paying attention to the idea that the solution process had fallen apart in Turkey. It can contribute to these conversations. It just doesn't always have as strong of a voice, perhaps, as its partners.
Well, we appreciate that. Please, here. And please state your name and affiliation, and keep it brief and a question.
I will try. Thank you. And my name is Khalid Fatah from Voice of America. Thank you for this opportunity and great discussion about this issue in Iraq. I think the panelists, they missing the two main issues. One of them, there is a sectarian war in Iraq led by Saudi Arabia, the Sunni side, and the Iran, the Shiite side. This conflict, it's inside the Iraq, and the Iraqi government is taking a side in this conflict. This is the reason we hearing from many sources that a group of the terrorism, which is, if the Iranian talking about it, and when they Sunni or Saudi Arabia, they consider them as a freedom fighter in Iraq. So this is the issue of the Iraq. It is the sectarian. The government, they have a sectarian policy, and this is the reason that ISIS expanded in Iraq and occupied one-third of it.
I take that to be a comment. Is there a question?
Yes. My question to the ambassador is Iraqi government ready to get rid of that policy to build integrated, stable Iraq? And the other thing, my question to Mr. Moussaoui, he mentioned to the 1974 agreement in Algeria.
1975.
74. I think you forget to say what's the reason of that agreement that Iraq give up a part of its land to Iran. There is an issue, it's called Kurdish issue in Iran, in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iraq. And this issue, if not being solved, this conflict, it will continue. The conflict, sectarian conflict, and the national conflict.
Let me stop you there. No, let me stop you there. You've asked two good questions. Mr. Ambassador?
Well, actually, I see myself as an employee of the government, but I serve the state, okay? The question that you're asking should be addressed to elected officials. So I suggest the following. Mid-November, we're getting a visit by the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament, Salim al-Jabouri, okay? So why don't you host him here, and you can come back and ask him that question yourself.
Seems a good offer to me.
But I serve the state, and the state is non-sectarian.
Professor?
The 1975 treaty between Iran and Iraq was not about Kurdistan of Iran. It was about the borders and how to define the borders. If you are for integration or disintegration of countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey to have independent Kurdistan, I don't believe anyone would support internationally except Israel. And the regional countries, every country would resist to keep their integrity and sovereignty. This integration, if it happens in any country, whether this is Iraq or Syria, is not going to end to that country. This would continue. Many countries, they would collapse, and I believe at the end, Iranians and Turks, they are the most strong countries which they would be able to keep their integrity and sovereignty. The others, they would be the most vulnerable to any disintegration. This is very dangerous.
But
idea
Professor,
which you are.
let me ask you to follow up on that. How would Iran like to see the future evolution of what happens between Erbil and Baghdad? We have facts on the ground that have been established. What do you think is needed to move forward to prevent the kind of disintegration you're talking about?
Ambassador knows better than me, but as far as I understand, full implementation of Iraqi constitution, because this was negotiated for something like 1 year, Ambassador, between Kurds, Sunnis, and Shias. Americans, they were there. Many countries, they were involved. Ultimately, they agreed on a new constitution. This constitution should be respected. If Kurds, they have rights, some rights, undermined by Baghdad, based on this constitution, this should be revived. Otherwise, disintegration is not solution.
Can I speak quickly on the Kurdish
yes,
issue?
Please.
Because I think this is something that I'm surprised we didn't have sort of a question asked to all of us on this, because I think it's especially not only timely, but incredibly important in understanding not only internal politics, but regional politics. A lot of people would look at Turkish politics and say almost every issue has to do with the Kurds in some way or another. The current ruling and Justice and Development Party government, if it did anything well, they did make an outreach to the Kurds with the solution process from 2013 to 2015. And part of this had to do not only with trying to stop the essential civil war that's been going on since 1984, but also to improve its relations in the region. Its relations with Iran, with Iraq, and with Syria are intimately intertwined with the Kurdish issue. And all four of those countries have played Kurdish politics when it suits their interests. Syria supporting camps where PKK fighters have been training. So there's a key interest in Turkey from a national security perspective, from a democratization perspective, and also from a foreign policy perspective that affects Iran, Iraq, and Syria in solving the Kurdish issue. And I think, looking back and analyzing what went wrong with that, I mentioned that it started bombing the PKK on the same day that it agreed to start fighting ISIS, and I think that this is a lesson for countries in terms of what can go wrong when you try to have national reconciliation and democratic federalism and all these kinds of things, is that the Kurds were played as a political card in Turkish domestic politics. And the outreaches to the Kurds were mostly in sort of the pursuit of the AKP's presidential project, that is moving forward with a constitutional referendum that will allow Erdogan to institute presidentialism and to stay in power. He saw the Kurds as a potential ally. He looked around the domestic political constituency and saw them as an ally. And they saw this as an opportunity to finally move forward in terms of having cultural and political rights and potentially some form of autonomy. And what happens when you have a man who is so focused on this kind of policy and this kind of ambition is that once those Kurds were no longer willing to support the presidential project, if you remember what happened in Kobani and the blaming of Kurds rightfully in the sense that Turkey was allowing ISIS fighters to live unscathed in Turkey and to flow across the borders, the Kurds thought, you don't have our back, why should we have yours? And they pull out of the presidential project and the sort of, solution process falls apart. So this issue that has so many regional implications in terms of Turkey-KRG relations, in terms of Turkey-Baghdad relations, in terms of Turkey's relations with Syria and Iran as well, can be subject to the whims of an individual, and at this point it doesn't really make sense to call the AKP a party, it's an individual-led party. They can be subject to these personal ambitions, and I think that is an important lesson that we need to take away for any country that has a minority that would like its rights to be more well respected, but might be subject to being vulnerable to being exploited in that process.
Mr. Ambassador, it's your country.
Indeed it is.
I suspect you agree with Professor Mousavian on the Constitution.
Well, I definitely. I mean, it's a roadmap. We want to keep our house in order, and the order is dictated by the Constitution, which spells out the duties and the privileges of each community. It's been really well thought out, although it does leave some things to be yet completed. But I wanted to address three issues. Some have mentioned, Mr. Mousavian has mentioned border issues, river issues. That is one thing, one point of discussion that we'll have for years to come with our neighbors in Turkey and in Syria, in Syria and Iran.
And Turkey.
Turkey, Syria, and Iran. Because we have been absent because of the war, because of the fact that the previous Iraqi government was not interested in pursuing this or couldn't. Dams have been built on the rivers that feed our land. They have been dried up. We really have to reconsider our rights as a downstream country on two of the main rivers of history. We're suffering from this. One thing. Second thing, after we defeat ISIS, of course we'll have the battle of reconstruction to win. But there are two others that we'll need to address. One is corruption, and that's one of the things that the Iraqi government is intent on focusing on. It's as bad as it's almost as bad as terrorism, and in fact, it's intimately sometimes related. Terrorism, but also governance. How to make sure that people, in the end, have a sense of ownership of both the political process and the economic process of the country. And that's the way for you to develop citizenship. Which brings me to the politics that we have, and that's my final point. Up to now, although less so than in recent years, our politics have been identity politics, too much so. There are reasons for that. The backlog of the fact that the previous regime denied identities to a lot of people, so they just flourished as soon as the lid was taken off. But also inappropriate electoral systems that were implemented not by the CPA for once, but by the United Nations that promoted identity voting. And there are really promising signs, talking to different politicians, even looking at the names of the various political parties, that indicate that there is a yearning within the Iraqi electorate writ large for issues that are important to them as voters, as electors, as citizens. I mean, state of law. That's a strong sign. People voted for it because of what it signifies. I mean, one political party had its which was known in 2009 or 2006, I don't remember, 2009, as the Martyrs List, has become the Citizens List. Citizen. Okay. And now this very same group has become the national, not Islamic, not a national wisdom movement. There is a yearning for people of the electorate for ideas that represent governance. And I won't mention his name, but I know of a prominent politician who has told me that he was going to develop an electoral platform based on governance issues, based on services to people, based on the duties that elected officials have towards their electors, to run on it. And if he's successful, he intends to try to build a coalition of like-minded parties within the parliament that would agree to it. And that would give us a platform perhaps to move us increasingly from identity politics to issues politics.
Let me open up the floor again. I think I better take 1, 2, 3, but brief.
A question, but if you can
introduce yourself.
Namo Abdullah, the Washington correspondent for Rudao. I would like to ask a question, and if you can weigh in on that issue as well, I would really appreciate it. So there's an editorial in the Wall Street Journal arguing that the Kurds are right to feel abandoned by the United States, and what the United States did in Kirkuk sets a bad precedent for other allies in the world, because the Kurds, as the paper argues, has been our best and most reliable ally. Would you agree that the Kurds are right to feel abandoned? Because there's this feeling of resentment actually in the social media toward the United States. And if any of you can weigh in, I would really appreciate it. Thanks.
Nike?
Thank you very much. My name is Nike Ching with the VOA as well. I have a question for the ambassador. Could you please give us your assessment of the situation in Kirkuk? I don't know if you got a chance to read the statement from, I can read it to you. The Iraqi Kurdistan region President Barzani's statement earlier today.
I actually have not. I've been running around. I should.
Okay, let me read it to you. This is from the reports. So he pledges to preserve the achievements of the Kurds despite Kirkuk setback. And also, according to another TV station, he's urging the Kurds to avoid civil war. So I would like to know your insights or your thoughts about this statement. Do you see any indication of a sense of calm over there? Thank you.
One more question.
And Desko Sherwani. My question is for Mousavian. You asked Iraqi to bring not 15% of the Sunni to government, but 20. But how about your government? I mean, I know the Kurd, I'm a Kurd, but the way your governor treat the Kurd, I mean, it go back like United States in the 1800s, they treat Sunni like a slave, and daily they hang about 18 Kurds every day.
Okay, let me
So, what do you
stop
answer
you
to
there, and we'll get an answer to that as well. Mr. Ambassador, I think you wanted to respond on Mr. Barzani.
Well, avoiding civil war, I'm all for it. But on Kirkuk, Kirkuk is not part of the KRG. It's part, according to the Constitution, of the disputed territories under Article 140. And what has recently happened is a redeployment that is consistent with the Constitution that seeks to reach out to where we were in the status quo ante before ISIS came and disrupted our country.
Professor Mousavian, on the question of treatment of Kurds in Sunnis in Iran.
Iranian courts, after revolution, they have been free about their language officially. Never there has been any restriction. Education, judiciary, even in the courts, the judges are ruling based on Sunnah, not Shia. Therefore, they are in parliament, they are in government. Those courts, I mean, right after Saddam invaded Iran, in parallel, there was a separatist movement to integrate Kurdistan of Iran. Saddam decided to disintegrate Khuzestan, and there was a movement on the north to disintegrate Kurdistan. Since then, Iran has been in fight with the terrorist Kurdish group, which they have been freedom fighter. If this is,
okay.
no,
Yes, but
my point is this: to respect the decision of every sovereign independent country. Do not impose your idea. What Iraqi government should do, it is not our business. Respect Iraqi government, respect Iranian government, respect Syrian government, respect Saudi government, whatever they want to do. This was my point. To support the freedom movement to bring disintegration in the region? Is it really what you're looking for?
let me respond maybe to Namo. We're old friends. But I will be blunt. Who abandoned whom? The Americans begged the Kurds not to have this referendum. They said it wasn't the right time. They said this would disrupt the fight against ISIS. They said you needed to talk to Baghdad first and develop a proposal that could be presented to a referendum. And none of that advice was taken. And so, you know, I think the hard feelings, if we didn't have more important things to worry about, like the Iranian nuclear program and our own government and all sorts of other things, the hard feelings would be quite strong in the other direction. Look, Kurds and Americans have fought together against ISIS, against Saddam Hussein, and we could go through the whole litany. This was a bad moment in relations between the Kurds and the Americans, but you have to recognize where the interests of the Americans primarily lie, and they primarily lie with Baghdad. And that should surprise nobody. Sovereign states have interests that lie with other sovereign states. And it was a big mistake for Kurdistan to think that because it voted in a way that everybody knew it would vote, that therefore it would get recognized as a sovereign state. That's not the way these things work. So I don't want to underline it too much because I'm sure we'll be friends again. I'll be back on your television station. But I think you should, I want to change the frame a little. And the larger frame is that the Kurds abandoned the United States. Let me take a couple more.
I'd actually like to push back on that, if you don't mind. I do think that the Kurds are correct in believing that they've been abandoned, not this time around, but rather in 1991. There were a lot of promises that were made to Talabani, that were made to Kurds, that were not followed up on. And I think that the Kurds, because the Peshmerga have been such, and the YPG in Syria, have been such effective fighting forces, the US has been able to count on them and not necessarily have to put boots on the ground. And I think that in some way we need to recognize that. And I agree actually with your comment, and as well as the previous ambassador on the panel's comment, that this wasn't gone about the right way. You need to get your ducks in a row before you can have your political institution. You need to have the idea that you're going to get some kind of approval before you go ahead with it. And it was, interestingly, you had Iran, Turkey, and the US somehow aligning on the fact that they didn't want this to go ahead, which is a strange, bedfellows kind of a situation. But I think it is absolutely justifiable for Kurds to feel as though they've been abandoned in the past. And I think that even with Operation Provide Comfort, which did actually designate and lead to a de facto and then de jure recognition of the Kurdish region, yes, the West had a lot to do with that. And a lot of the refugees that had gone into Iran and had gone into Turkey came back, but not all of them. And so I think to say that there are a lot more important things to think about is to maybe not necessarily pay attention to the Kurdish fate the way that we should.
Well, one thing, if I may, the Kurds weren't the only one who felt they were abandoned in 1991.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. Two more quick questions. One here.
Hello, my name's Skips Narstal. I'm a student and just a generally curious person about these issues, and thank you for the phenomenal discussion. My question has to do with after ISIS loses the territory it's claimed, how much consideration is there to ISIS taking up strategies analogous to Al-Qaeda? And has the current fight against ISIS provided an effective foundation for a fight that's going to be much more centered on counterterrorism than on conventional warfare?
One more.
Hi, Bo Wilcox with the Osgood Center for International Studies. My question is, are we going to see more of a regional approach to combat the corruption within the Middle Eastern governments, where it's located? Thank you.
The fight against corruption and the future fight against insurgency in the region. Mr. Ambassador.
Well, actually on the fight against ISIS, so these things started with an insurgency which controlled territory, turned into a real insurrection, controlled territory, developed a proto-state, was able to start levying taxes. So now we're trying to have them go down that slope again by depriving them from territory, hence the importance of liberating Mosul and Raqqa in Syria and other places. But as they go down that slope, they're going to change their taxes, like you pointed out, And that implies that we will have to change the tactics along with them. Right now, we need armies to defeat them. But as they become a terrorist organization, we'll have to go more into intelligence gathering, counterterrorism. And the interesting thing is that this has been done before. It's what we did in 2009, 2010. So we know how to do it. I'm pretty confident that we will be able to do it. It's incumbent upon us as a responsible government to its people to do it.
Lisa, on corruption issues, maybe?
So actually, I guess on both. In terms of trying to pick an ally in the region to solve issues of corruption and issues of terrorism, I think picking Turkey would be a really bad choice. I think it would be a very serious case of the pot calling the kettle black. So, I mean, even in Syria right now, you know, Turkey's been fighting ISIS in Syria, but the main goal has been to preserve areas such that there's not a contiguous Rojava canton, right? So we want Turkish presence in there in Idlib. We want to make sure that, okay, we're routing out terrorism, but we also want to make sure that we don't have any kind of entity that could declare independence for the Kurds. And actually, in sending Turkish forces to Idlib, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham basically released a statement saying, you know, we're going to kind of welcome these guys because they may be able to help us. So there's no evidence that I see, even though Turkey did eventually end up closing its borders or becoming a little bit more secure about border control when it comes to ISIS, I don't see that they're moving away from their ties with extremist groups. And so I don't see that they're a very good ally in terms of the fight against terrorism. And again, the fight against corruption, you know, I've said what I had to say about Turkish corruption, so I think it needs to be done in the region. And what's actually quite ironic about this is that, so if you, for example, if you're talking about Turkey and you use the phrase AKP, you are kind of indicating that you're not a supporter of the party because AK Party, which is the moniker that party supporters go for, actually means pure party or white party or a party that is free from corruption. And that is a platform on which the AKP ran, as well as EU accession and you know, trying to develop the economy and so forth. So yes, I wouldn't say that the party that has engaged in so much corruption is a good model for the region or partner.
Mohammed? Yeah, I think these two issues are tied to each other. I mean, good governance is something that's sorely needed in the region. Strong states are needed. You know, non-state actors will flourish when states are weak. It sounds very simple, but this is the fact. I mean, in Lebanon, what the country needs is a strong armed forces contingent. It needs a strong government. The same can be said of the rest of the states in the region. So, you know, those people whose interests it is to have weak states and strong non-state actors will obviously work to expand their interest. In many countries, it's Iran that looks for weak states and powerful non-state actors like Hezbollah and the Fatimiyun, Zainabiyun, Afghan and Pakistani fighters that are in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus now, and its own contingent of fighters in Iraq. Making states powerful, representative, and promoting good governance is the only long-term solution to any of these issues. Using fire to fight fire and nitpicking over how good Hezbollah is isn't going to solve anything, really, I think.
Hussein?
Dysfunctionality of the governments, bad governance, corruption, actually is and has been one of the main sources of the regional problems. Perhaps if you are going to list the root causes of crisis or the collapse of perhaps many Arab countries, you would say bad governance, dictatorship, corruption. But frankly speaking, corruption is almost everywhere in the region, including Iran. You would hear from the highest level of Iranian officials every day complaining about corruption. And what mechanism do we need? It is not only about Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan. Every country in the region, there is no exception. They have problem with the corruption. About functionality of the systems, it's different. Of course, Iranian system is very, compared to the many other countries, they are very functional and powerful, strong, but it doesn't mean they have been able to resolve the corruption. It is not limited to the region. Even President Trump blamed the US as one of the most corrupted countries in the world, you know. It's everywhere.
Because of him.
He knows of what he speaks.
Yes, he does.
I am going to, with that 4:15 remark out of order, I am going to turn the platform back over to Randa Saleem.
On behalf of the Middle East Institute, I wish to thank our co-sponsor, the Conflict Management Program at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Program Director Daniel Serwer, and Program Office Coordinator Isabel Talmain Long. An event of this kind is the result of many hours of work over many weeks, and here on site today. I want to thank Mark Sheeland, our Director of Programs at the Middle East Institute, the MEI staff and interns who supported this conference, including Jessica Agostinelli, Scott Zucchi, Lina Abu Talib, Najla Al-Sudairi, Megan Giovannetti, Mary Yavari, and Christine Ayad. Please join me in a round of applause for them. MEI is grateful to the expert speakers who participated and to you, our audience, for your thoughtful and provocative questions. We thank you for attending and have a pleasant evening.